I am the eldest of 3 brothers, and this is some number of years ago now. I was 13 while my brothers were 11 and 9 respectively. We had been down the local park to play football and kill some time before it was time to sleep. School tomorrow. Great. This was our mindset at the time, so we greatly enjoyed burning off steam, running around and screaming at each other. It always got competitive, but in a fun, brotherly kind of way. We noticed a man in the distance, looking in our general direction, and it was still light and a public park, so we didn't think anything of it. However, we did note that it was kind of strange that he just stood there in the middle of the path. No dog, no children, no friends, nothing. My youngest brother also pointed out that he was wearing a trench coat. It was hot out, so pretty weird we thought, but we skipped over it as we found it kind of funny, as you can imagine, being young and immature, and found it in some ways amusing. You know that cliche that weirdos and creepers wear these coats. We made jokes that he was completely naked under there, and that some poor soul would eventually be exposed to this man's full nudity. We soon forgot about it and continued with our game. With the sun setting, we decided it was time to go. This was around a half hour after we'd seen the man, and to be honest, we had completely forgotten about him in our competitiveness. We look up, and he's still there. He hadn't moved an inch. This creeped us out, so we walked the long way back towards town, as he was blocking the shortcut, and none of us really wanted to pass by him. He was tall, and we aren't a particularly tall family. Even at that age, we were short, and this guy was easily over 6 foot. But it was hard to tell from where we were standing. Regardless, he was too tall to risk anything. We headed home teasing each other the other way for letting that guy creep us out, even though he didn't really do anything. Accusing each other of pissing our pants and crying. It was quite funny in truth, as brotherly teasing is at that age, especially when you're all in on the joke, or the subject at least. Once we arrived at town and continued past the shops and takeaway places, my youngest brother insists we go grab something to eat. He complains he's starving and hasn't eaten since lunch. It was the same case for all of us, so we agree and head to our local takeaway. It wasn't great, but it was cheap, and being kids we didn't have much money, so it was perfect for us. A burger and some chips for £2. I can't lie, a great deal. We order, pay up, and sit down as usual waiting for food. We start talking and messing around. We didn't even look when the door chimed to let us know somebody had come into the establishment. Why would we? I'm sitting on the far right, facing nothing in particular, while my brothers are sat facing each other. They're arguing about something, and I'm sat there bored and hungry, and I began to scan the room, when I look directly to my left and my heart drops. Who do I see sat on the table opposite ours? None other than the guy from the park. The trenchcoat guy staring at us, and I mean really staring. He's closer now, so I can see him. His eyes are wide. I mean it. It looked like his eyes were going to roll out their sockets at any given moment. His facial expressions were one that made me feel uneasy. He was looking at us like he wanted to hurt us. You might think he's just hungry or having a bad day, but there's no way he chose this particular takeaway after staring at us all that time, and there was no mistaking him. My only guess is that he must have followed us. I mean, we weren't careful. We never checked behind us. Why would we? Several seconds go past and it feels like minutes. This guy is looking at me, and he just starts to angrily grind his teeth with the same mad look on his face. Honestly, he looked insane. It's at this point I look away and quietly tell my brothers that the guy from the park has followed us here and is over there staring at us. Now my youngest brother has never been one for subtlety, and he blurts out loudly, "What, the freak from the park?" Me and my other brother look at each other, eyes wide, and then back at my youngest brother. The confused look on his face, how he didn't realize how weird this whole situation actually was. We simultaneously turn our heads and look back at the man who is now standing, eyes mad, intensely focused on my little brother. His face was bright red, and the vein in his forehead was almost bursting from his skin. We all just looked back, unsure of what to do. It was at this second that our food was ready and brought over to our table. We thanked him, and I know what you're thinking. Maybe this guy was just waiting for a meal and got annoyed when my brother referred to him as a freak. But he was already staring. But that aside, it was confirmed when the cook asked him if he was ready to take his order, and the man just shook his head. We were all starting to feel a little on edge, but figured surely the safest thing to do would be to stay inside a public place. So we started eating, and I even got a nudge from my brother. I look, and the man is now stood towering over us looking down. Without warning, he slams a handful of plastic forks from the counter onto our table. At first we try and ignore it, but he starts to breathe heavily, almost hyperventilating. Being the oldest, I feel I should say something in my sternest voice, which of course wasn't very stern at all. I told him we were fine, and thank you, and I hoped he enjoyed his meal. Kill him with kindness, I thought. Dumb idea. Without warning, he spreads all the forks frantically over the table, grabs a handful, and shoves them in his mouth and starts chewing them. I didn't have words. The noise is disgusting, and the crunching and choking. I look around to see if anyone else is seeing this, but there isn't anyone but us, and the cooks are in the back preparing the food. It's just us and this lunatic. Blood starts pouring from his mouth as he continues to churn these plastic forks, as he looks to my youngest brother and hisses. It's at this point we nope out of there and leave. We don't even take our food. Well, except my youngest brother, who I guess just wanted to leave after seeing. We didn't even take our food with us except for my youngest brother, who I guess just wanted to leave after seeing that, without even putting his plastic container down. We all quickly walk away, none of us talking. What could we say? We were speechless, but the look we gave each other was enough. Like, damn, did that really happen? Without warning, the man appeared from behind us, grabbed my youngest brother by the hand, and my blood turned to ice. I felt powerless. I felt paralyzed. He was so quiet. None of us heard him sneak up on us. We couldn't believe it. We'd looked behind us multiple times to make sure we weren't being followed. We were in shock he was there. He must have come through some side street or shortcut. Me and my brother just shot each other a panicked look, while my youngest brother struggled to set himself free. He hit him over the head with his food container, which was open, and of course did nothing. But as he pushed food into his eyes, it did give my brother and I a split second to do something, and I'll never forget it. Without thinking and without hesitation, my brother picked up a broken brick which lay in a pile next to a smashed up wall and swung it at the man's head with some force. He instantly let go but didn't fall, and we all booked it out of there. And he chased us, growling like some wild animal. He almost gained on us at one point, his long legs carrying him further with each stride. He was carrying something in his hand, but we were running, and couldn't see it, not that any of us wanted to find out. Eventually we lost him. in a somewhat busy part of town, and then finally made it home. We tried to tell our mum, but of course she didn't believe us. Mums never do. I know this story may seem tame to most, but it freaked us out, not least my youngest brother. Poor kid. He still hasn't been back to that takeaway. None of us have. So much for £2 meal deals. Never mind, a small price to pay. I'm just glad we did stop there that day and not head straight home. See, our mum doesn't trust us with a key, so she often leaves the front door unlocked until we arrive. If he had followed us there, and he had forced his way in, or even noticed this, it could have been much worse. I shudder to think. It was late spring in my 7th year of school. It was a rough school in a sketchy area. I was in the 3rd year of my middle school, crafting a magnet program to better integrate the classes, and the enrollment for the program was small. Even smaller numbers for female, so making female friends in an isolated environment as this was difficult at best. That's when I met Sabrina. She was non-magnet and wanted to have me and her friend Kylie spend the night, so I was thrilled. She lived in an apartment with her mother and brother that was across from a racetrack and a bar. Super sketchy area. Her mother sold handmade keychains at the flea market each weekend. This is important later. Things get weird about the time we get pizza and movies. Her mother was a little odd and hung out the whole time. Like, she was a 13-year-old girl and regularly going into her room and calling Sabrina. We couldn't ask what was up because her mum was always there, and this was the age of pages. So around 9 p.m. she goes to bed. To our dismay, 10 minutes later, she's calling Sabrina to come to bed too. She was actually going to stay with her mum at her own sleepover, so left with a few pillows that had seen better days and no blankets, Kylie and I were going to have a sleepover to ourselves. We start the movie back up, and suddenly Sabrina comes out to get the phone. As she is about to go back into the room, she whispers, "Don't stay up late. We have to go to work at the flea market tomorrow and leave at 5:30. I guess she saw our faces and she giggles this creepy giggle and adds, "You didn't think the pizza was for free, did you?" Then she goes into the room and locks the door. Kylie, who I had just met this evening, and I exchange glances. This was the first we heard about this. We were never even asked. After a short conversation, we decided we wanted to go home. Our parents were more likely to be awake now than they would at 5:30 in the morning, so we knock on the bedroom door, to no answer. We try and try, but nothing. There's no way they're asleep that fast. So I go to the kitchen to see if there's another phone. Nope. They locked us in the living room of this one-bedroom apartment with no phone and no restroom, and now they weren't responding at all. This is where the young and dumb formulate a plan. We know school isn't very far away, and Kylie says she lives near school, so we decide to find a payphone or walk to her house. How bad could it be? Biggest mistake of our lives. We try knocking one last time to the same result, so we gather our belongings and leave. How the world outside changed after 10 p.m. The bar a stone's throw away from the apartment was jumping. We go up to the payphone that's near the street and close to the rear of the bar. It's broken. As I put down the receiver, some burly, drunk man rounds the corner towards us. We were two 13-year-olds that could have passed for 17 easily. Neither of us were dressed showing much skin, but Mr. Drunk Dude liked what he saw. First he yelled if we wanted a party, or if he could buy us drinks. "No thanks," we replied, and started to walk in the direction of her home. This only infuriated him, as he's now yelling, that we're skanks and nobody turns their back on him. We keep on. He starts to stumble after us and catches Kylie by the wrist. She's trying to shake him off to no avail, and he's telling us what he's going to do to us. We're getting terrified because she can't break the hold and he won't let go. That's when Kylie lands a shot into his crown jewels. We take off running, but the shot must have sobered him up, and he's angrier in pursuit. We scan the area. There's no place to hide, no place to get help, and we're now not trusting if we saw anyone that would help us. We run loops around the apartment Sabrina lived in, but somehow one of Mr. Drunk's friends had joined in. We knew they were behind us, and that they are alienating, tailing us, and the yelling to his friends, saying that there's one for each of us. So, to not let us get away. Now we know we're trapped, so we book it up some random metal stairs. We hit the second floor, are banging doors, but nobody is opening them. Luckily, we find an open door at the end, and we think we're in the clear. But then we hear constant clanking and one of them is coming up, but the stairs have no second floor visibility. We dash into the room only to see it's a laundry room, with no door to lock. We start wedging ourselves behind the machines, praying and hoping we're not found, because he's now on the second floor and heading our way. It goes quiet, except music and voices from the bar. He didn't leave, I think. I didn't hear the stairs. That's when the aroma of smoke and alcohol descends upon the heavy air. He's in the door listening, and then he speaks. I know you're in there, girls. There's nowhere for you to go. If you come out now, I'll forgive the one that kicked my nuts and go easy on you both. Come on out. After a moment, he spoke again. His mood flipped. Okay, I'm gonna yank you out by your hair and rough it up. I'd like to say that someone overheard all of this and intervened, but they didn't. After what seemed like an eternity, he stood there for 10 minutes. We heard him descend the stairs, and we were hiding an additional 15 minutes before checking to see if it was safe to leave. Long story short, we made it to Kylie's house, which was not as close as she said, but we had our lives. My father came to get me after midnight. The next morning, Sabrina's mother called and feigned cluelessness as to why we would leave, claiming we didn't knock, lied about taking the phone, and thought it was normal to make her daughter's friends have to work for free. Sabrina and I didn't speak much after Kylie's parents believed all of Sabrina's mother's nonsense and grounded her for a month. This was a long time ago, but it has stayed haunting me since. I was asleep for most of the day and woke up at 1 a.m. and I realized while asleep no one bought something to drink from the house, and I'm pretty sure the jug of water was all gone by this point. I decided to do what I usually do and go out to this one store that stays open even late at night. Now I usually try to avoid going there, so I try to avoid leaving too late to go outside to go get something if we really need it, mainly because the store sucks, and the fact I don't like being outside too late, even if I'm close or near my home, especially these streets. There's nothing wrong with my neighborhood, and it's quite safe actually. Just the 5 or 6 blocks between here and the block I have to turn to go down to get to the store. And my cousin, who is staying with me until he gets back on his feet, made me even more paranoid than I already am. He started talking about this woman going missing in our city and all this stuff, and that he actually saw a missing poster recently around here, which is rare to see as this neighborhood is quite safe. So I didn't really want to leave but knew I had to. I left the house and started walking to the store, and noticed this time there were 0 people out, not even any cars coming by. As I mentioned, usually you would see some people out, but not today. There was nothing. Just me. This put me on edge. I have a history of being followed because New York City can be like that. I always look back behind me. And when I'm walking, I always look behind me to confirm if a person is following me or not, and make a plan to be sure to evade them if necessary. I keep turning my head slightly to see through shadows and windows if something or someone was following me. Nothing and no one showed up. I did my usual and crossed the street on the 3rd block and kept walking down the same path, just on a different side of the road. I only do this because once I get to the 5th block, I have to be on that side of the road to turn the corner and walk down that block. As I said, I would turn around to check if someone has popped up and if they're following me. To my surprise, there's this black SUV slowly driving right behind me. I couldn't see who was inside. At first, I try not to let paranoia get the better of me and begin to rationalize the situation and thought this person was either looking for parking or was about to park due to the headlights that were pointed more in the direction of the sidewalk, as if it was about to go and park right next to it. To be honest, that rationalization of it made no sense since the block was filled with cars parked, and usually if a person can't find parking, they drive around and not slow down near a sidewalk. I kept looking back frequently to see what the person in the SUV was going to do, and the more I kept walking, the more I kept attempting to rationalize the situation. But that went out the window as the car kept going with no change of pace behind me onto a different block. And the only time it did change its pace was when I was starting to change my pace and walk faster. But it still went slow enough where you couldn't even hear it. My first thought was that if I couldn't run around and go back home, and I sure as hell can't find a police station around here to go into. If I'm being followed, obviously I should text someone and call them to talk to me just in case something happens. So I sent my location to the main people I spoke to, my mum, my boyfriend, and my friend and my dad. That was weird enough for her to detect that something was wrong. I kept looking behind me, and I guess I looked back enough where whoever was in the SUV noticed that I noticed them, and that's when they decided to speed up and go park at the beginning of the next block. The block I was literally about to cross the street into. They didn't even park fully into the block. There wasn't even enough space on that road. Their lights were still on, and they were just waiting there, idling. I stopped where I was and kept talking to my mum. Hell, I wasn't even really talking at this point. I was just trying to do anything to keep her on the line with me. My mum couldn't tell anything was wrong, and I stood there, not even really walking fast from where I was. If anything, I was slowly taking steps backwards. In that moment, I was making a choice, because the SUV was obviously not looking for parking. Best case scenario, whoever was inside was doing whatever they were doing and didn't have anything to do with me. Worst case, they were planning to do something to me. Now, I didn't think the best case scenario was going on. I'm not dumb. And if it had nothing to do with me, they wouldn't have slowed down and lured behind me for a whole block. My mind went to worst case scenario, and I'm debating on slowly going back towards my house, where they wouldn't notice since I'm still behind them. That instantly went out the window, because something I learned is to never lead anyone back to your home if they're following you. And as I said, there's no police stations nor fire stations nearby. No one was around, no cars passing through, so I stood there and the SUV stayed right there. No one coming out or in. I didn't want to take the risk of walking onto the next block either. I'm guessing the person noticed I wasn't walking anymore, and it fully registered into them that I saw them when they drove down to the end of the block to try and hide among the parked cars. It would have worked had I not moved a certain angle to see that they went and parked in a place I couldn't have seen them at if I'd have kept walking, which was around the corner at the end of the next block. And again, no one got out the SUV. It stayed on and was just idling there. I still did not cross the road onto the next block. I did not continue my route to this store because that meant walking down the block, and I wasn't risking anything to go pick something up. So I slowly took a few steps back, turned and went home, due to the fact whoever was inside wouldn't have noticed if I turned around and left. I sprinted fast back to my house, kept looking behind me to see if the SUV had turned back around or noticed. Gladly, I made it back home and no one followed me. But I was shaken up and refused to test my luck to go out and buy stuff for the house, even if the SUV was long gone. I'd rather wait till morning so that I could see. Looking back, the SUV literally popped up out of nowhere. Considering the fact I always look behind me frequently, and I do not remember even seeing it anywhere parked or driving anywhere when I looked behind me before that, and didn't even hear it pull up either, makes me pretty sure whoever was there was more than likely trying to take me. I was actually planning on stopping looking behind me, as I saw no one prior, and I was going to walk and simultaneously watch a YouTube video. I actually was just walking and looking at my phone once I hit the third block. Had something not told me in my intuition to look behind me, I wouldn't have noticed the SUV, and don't even want to imagine what would have happened because of that. I'm currently a 24-year-old female, and all of this happened 3 years ago. I live in a very small town. Like if you sneezed while driving on the highway, you'd miss half of it. In this town, it's pretty much the picture of everyone knows everyone. Because of this, I've been walking around on my own since I was in middle school, and I've never felt unsafe. On this day, I had just been at my boyfriend's family's shop, uptown, which was about 4 blocks or so from my house. I'd been speaking with him and his mother, helping out a bit in the shop, and then headed home. My boyfriend and I didn't live together yet. I still resided with my grandmother and brother. When I was about a street away from my house, a car pulled up beside me, and it was a guy named Ben who I've known for a long time. He was a year younger than I, and his older brother was in my grade at school, so I've known him and considered him a friend since we were little. He had 2 girls in the car with him, one I knew called Carly, and one I didn't. Ben asked where I was going, so I said, going home. So then he offered to drive me. I'd like to pause and point out that he was driving in the opposite direction away from my house. His grandfather and uncle live across the street from me, and he knows exactly where I live, and has been to my house multiple times to help out with small chores like shoveling snow and trimming a hedge. So he definitely knew I was almost home. Ben would have had to drive all the way around the block to take me home, and I was literally 1 street away from it, and I could see my house from where I was standing. So I politely declined, and said it would only take me a few more minutes to walk there. He then offered again, but insisted, "Can I give you a ride?" It had changed to, "Just get in the car," and I started getting weird vibes, so I declined again, thanked him for the offer, and wished him a good afternoon, and started walking. He then put his car in reverse and backed down the street, following me and matching my pace. Now I hear him say something to the effect of, "Don't just walk off, get in the car now." I've gotten rides with friends before. I've even ridden with Ben in a car that mutual friends were driving, because it was 100 degrees out and I had to walk to the square, and they passed by me as I was leaving the house. I do have a car and a license, but I'm pretty much broke and don't like to use gas if I can help it. So I walk a lot. Not to mention the fact that outside 1 or 2 locations, anywhere I need to go in the town is less than a 30-minute walk from my house. As I've said, very small town. I've accepted rides from friends before when it was pouring with rain or freezing cold, or if I had armfuls of groceries from the dollar store down the road from me. And once, for a week or 2, I rode with friends to school or co-workers to work because my car got totaled in a collision. Thankfully, everyone was fine in that. But on this day, it was a breezy and beautiful summer's day. I had no groceries, and with not a cloud in the sky and my front door just ahead of me. But yet Ben was insisting and even demanding that I enter his car. At this point, Carly, who was in the back seat, was looking a little uncomfortable, and she looked like she was just going to try and get him to keep driving. The girl in the front, who I didn't know, was laughing, and looking back on it, she may or may not have been high. I kept telling Ben that I was fine, and I was less than 10 yards from my front door, but he kept insisting, swearing at me, and telling me to get in the car or else. Luckily, a truck drove up, and Ben had to drive away because he had pulled into the wrong side to talk to me and was blocking the road. I ran the rest of the way home, and messaged my boyfriend everything that just happened from the safety of my bedroom. I didn't tell my grandma just then because she was napping, and I didn't want to wake her. Now, remember how I'd said I'd been at their shop about 4 blocks away? Well, my boyfriend was at my front door in about 5. He, like me, does not drive. He ran the entire way, wanting to make sure I was okay since, apparently, Ben had some issues in the past that I was not aware of. I met him at our front door and told him again everything that happened. I kid you not. We stood on my front lawn talking. I looked up the street I had just walked down and saw the car, Ben's car, pull up the 4-way stop there facing my street. And he just sat there for a few minutes. No blinkers on, no indication of moving. Then without signaling, he made a turn and vanished. Just a few minutes later, he appeared on the opposite end of my street, cruising very slowly, right past the empty lot next to my house. I was really freaking out, and then he showed up on the turnoff directly across the street from my front lawn and pulled up in front of me and my boyfriend. My boyfriend put himself between us as Ben rolled down his window and started saying he wanted to speak to me. The 2 girls were still with him, and now Carly looked really uncomfortable, but I wasn't saying anything. The other one was still grinning and laughing. My boyfriend was yelling at Ben to back off and leave me alone. Ben was yelling that he wasn't doing anything to me, and I had moved from freaked out to full-on scared. My boyfriend was demanding why he was circling the house, and Ben claimed he hadn't been doing that. Now my grandma called me back inside because her phone was ringing, and it woke her up. I go in and Carly is calling from inside the car. For some reason, instead of rolling down the window and talking to me, she called my home phone to explain to me that Ben was just picking up a friend who lived down the turnoff, and he wasn't circling our place. She said this even though there was no one new in the car with them. So who were they picking up? I hung up, went back outside where my boyfriend and Ben were still having a shouting match, and eventually it culminated with Ben driving off. My boyfriend stuck around for a while to keep an eye out, but then needed to return to the shop to help his mother, as he'd run out and left her running it alone, only stopping long enough to say I needed help. He told me to call if Ben returned, and to ring the cops if necessary. Literally not 20 minutes after my boyfriend left, Ben pulled up in front of my house again, but this time the girls were gone. It was just him. He knocked at my door and I was genuinely terrified that I hid where he couldn't see me through the door, and my grandma answered. Now, my grandma raised 6 kids, including me and my brother. She worked retail, had been a single mother, and dealt with all manner of assholes, and does not take crap from anyone. And this is a literal tank when it comes to kids. So the instant she pulled the door open, she started screaming at him that if he didn't leave me the hell alone, she was going to call the police, as well as tell everyone in his family, as again we lived across from his granddad and uncle, what he was doing to me. He started spouting some excuse about how it was only a joke and he was just kidding around. He also kept insisting he wanted to talk to me and asked her to let me outside to talk. I was still hiding at this point in tears and shaking, and my grandma tore into him, telling him she didn't care if it was just a joke. He was stalking me, had threatened me and harassed me by continuing to come to our home, and if he didn't get off our property in the next 60 seconds, the police would be arriving at his place very shortly. He then left, but for the next month or more, I was terrified of running into him alone again. If I went anywhere, I had someone come with me, and I didn't walk anywhere for weeks. I found out later that he had shown up at my boyfriend's mum's shop later that day, but my boyfriend and his brother had yelled him out. I'm not sure if maybe he thought I'd be there, or if he was just trying to convince them it was just a joke. About a year after all this happened, I ran into Ben while I was out, and he gave me an apology for scaring me, insisting he'd only been joking and I overreacted. I, being a bit of a pushover, decided to accept his apology, but I let him know that he had severely damaged my trust in him, and that he should never expect me to go or be anywhere alone with him again. He accepted that, and now years later, I've seen him a few different times in public places, and exchanged pleasantries with him before making an exit, and mostly when my boyfriend was present. Things got somewhat resolved between them as well, but my boyfriend made sure to let him know if he ever did something like that again, he would regret it. And to this day I've never gone or stayed anywhere with Ben where it was just him and me. Anytime I run into him on a quiet street, I say a quick hello and keep walking. This has made me very wary. I'll always be looking over my shoulder to make sure he isn't there. So to the friend who followed me home, let's not meet again. I was 19 years old. I was in Paris, as I had been many times before. However, this time I was not alone, but with one female friend of mine. She'd been asking me often to join me on my weekend trips because she wanted to share my exciting lifestyle. She listened to my stories of models and movie stars hanging out at my favorite Parisian club and wanted to join in on the fun. So we decided to take this trip together. We booked a train ticket and a room in a cozy hotel near Châtelet, and we went. On our first day, we walked for hours, checking out just a few of the many colorful areas where I used to always hang out. Late in the afternoon, we decided to go back to the hotel, have something to eat, and then prepare ourselves to go clubbing. While doing so, though, my friend started to feel sick. Maybe she ate something that her stomach disagreed with. But let's just say that the bathroom became her best friend. And so I suggested we stay in the hotel, watch a movie or something, and head back out the day after. My friend, though, feeling guilty for holding me back, insisted I would go to the club on my own. I was used to walking around my favorite city alone, but I did not feel comfortable leaving her by herself. She kept assuring me she'd be fine, so I got myself ready for a night out and went. As I got to the club, there was a huge crowd standing in line, waiting to be chosen by this female bouncer. It looked like she was checking people out from a distance to decide whether they were worthy of getting in. When I got there, a limousine pulled up and the crowd was ordered to move for the special guest. No waiting in line for him. I was all the way in the back of the line, but since I'm very tall and back then had a model look, the bouncer looked me up, pointed at me and asked if I was alone. As soon as I told her, she gestured for me to come in. And so I walked through the crowd of about 100 people to the front door of the club, feeling quite special for having been selected. I had an amazing time. I danced all night with people I'd never met before, yet we were like one big dance crew. It felt great. Good music, good dancers, and I had the time of my life, which for me only takes those two ingredients. About 4 in the morning, I felt it was time to go back to the hotel. I had an active day ahead of me, so I needed at least a few hours of sleep, and I left. I felt very at home in this big city, and I decided to walk back to the hotel. And although every now and then a car would pull up next to me, thinking I was walking around so late looking for work, a simple no always made it clear that my purpose was actually from get to A to B, and not make money while doing so. I felt totally safe as I continued my little stroll in the early morning, gradually approaching the hotel. I wanted to cross the road to make sure I could do that safely, even though there was no traffic, as the city was asleep at this time. I looked left and right, and then saw him, a young man on a sports bike on the sidewalk about 30 meters behind me. As soon as he saw that I had noticed him, he sped up and started riding his bike next to me. I crossed the road and he followed, asking for a cigarette. I told him I don't smoke, but considering the fact that I was female and all by myself, I decided not to be kind to him. In this situation, it might easily be misunderstood. I answered, but that was it. I clearly showed him I wasn't in the mood to talk, and he seemed numb to the rejection and carried on behind me, without saying a word. Meanwhile, we had gotten to this small park, Chatalet, which separated me from the hotel, but I felt uneasy and started to panic because of this guy. It was in the early morning, but every few minutes you could hear a car in the distance and no one else to be seen in the streets. God help me, I'm in trouble, I thought. And this is what makes the story unbelievable. Out of nowhere came a car from the left, stopped, honked his horn and waved at me. I walked towards him and asked him for help. When I looked back at the guy on the bike, I noticed that the two other guys had joined him. They must have been walking behind me. As soon as I spoke to the driver, the biker started yelling at me and threatening me. It was scary, and all the things he said he would do to me, it still makes chills run down my spine. The guy in the car, a total stranger, told me that he was willing to help me take me back to my hotel, however risky that was. Refusing his offer meant that I would be alone again, and then definitely in danger. So I jumped in. When he started driving, I was still in shock, but every time he turned into a street that would just seem to go in the other direction, I panicked. He assured me that if I felt unsafe, I could just get out, and that there are many one-way streets in Paris, and there was simply no other way to get to where I wanted to go. I trusted him, and he did as he said and drove me to the front door of my hotel and left. I went to my room and had a very scary story to tell to my friend, who was quite happy after all that she had been unable to join me. My family lives in a small town in central Minnesota, and things like this hardly ever happen here. It was a startling surprise. Anyway, last night my mother and my grandma decided to go shopping at a Target in a nearby town for groceries and a couple of other things for my grandmother's house. They pulled into the parking lot, entered the store and began shopping. Pretty normal night shopping so far. My grandma and mum usually shop separately, so they grabbed carts and went off in their own directions. This is when things got a little weird. My mum and grandma both noticed this rather strange man wearing a tan t-shirt and bland jeans, aimlessly walking the empty aisles of Target, seemingly with no objective. My mum had noticed him a few times at that point, always in the same aisle as her, and each time he had been throwing small glances at her, trying really hard to be inconspicuous, but failing. He would just stand there, throw glances at her, whilst pretending to browse the shelves. My mum was starting to get a little creeped out at this point, but tried to brush it off. Mum moved on to another aisle to look for Gatorade cases, and happened to lose him for a bit. My mother, now feeling a little better because the man was nowhere to be found, picked up some Gatorade, threw it in the cart, and glanced at her list once more. Just as she was about to move on to the chips aisle, she received an ominous call from my grandma. Evidently, after my mum left the aisle the man was in, my grandma noticed the same man speed walking down the center aisle of the grocery section, looking down each aisle for my mum, turning his head wildly in every direction. My grandma told her to be careful, and my mum agreed and hung up, to hurry up and finish her shopping. As they were finishing up, my mum went over to the cards shelf and looked at a few things. As she was doing this, the man seemed to appear out of nowhere, and my mum nearly plowed him over with her cart. She quickly apologized, but as soon as she saw his face, she made a beeline for the checkout 50 meters away where my grandma was waiting. My mum and grandma checked out together, hearts pounding as the man walked up right behind them in the checkout line, a little too close for comfort. The man was apparently hunched over, his head concealed as he was facing away from them, taking notes or something with a small notepad, while looking at every one of them once in a while. My mum began to feel sick from fear at this point, and as soon as they paid, they took off quickly out the door to my mum's large SUV. The man was buying 2 small glass cups, giving them time to run off as he checked out himself. Unfortunately, my mum and grandma had only just begun to unload their groceries into the SUV when he came out staring them down. He strode over to his white Ford Escape, which was parked just across the lot from my mum, and got into it, holding his shopping bag with the 2 cups. Now my mum and grandma were frantic. They basically threw the remainder of the groceries into the back of the SUV and took off, trying to lose the man. Sure enough, he followed. My mum was still not completely sure what to do, and drove off the normal route to the highway, where she decided to try something. At the junction to the highway that leads to our hometown, instead of continuing straight on the current road, my mum abruptly slammed on the brakes and turned right onto the highway towards our town, pedal to the metal. Mum regrets doing this because the man from Target did the exact same thing. The distance my mum put between her and the man was quickly closed when he caught up to her, tailgating her SUV incredibly closely. At this point, my mum was freaking out, her knees shaking. They were only 5 miles from home at that point, and were out in the middle of nowhere, not knowing what to do. She continued accelerating up to 90 miles per hour to try and put more distance between them, and sure enough, he did the same and caught up again. After what seemed like a whole day, they finally reached town. At the first stoplight, my mother slammed on her brakes and took a hard right onto the first road in town. The man, not expecting this, continued on. My mum, thinking this was all over, pulled into the McDonald's just off the road and took a few breaths before going back on the road. She turned onto a frontage road and headed towards our home, now only 1 mile away, but nearly had a heart attack when she noticed a pair of headlights belonging to an ever-familiar white Ford Escape turning onto the same frontage road from the next street up. The man must have turned right at the next lane. My mum told me herself it was like time suddenly slowed down as they passed each other. Upon seeing my mum's SUV, the man slammed on his brakes in the middle of the road and made an illegal U-turn to get back on her tail, and my mum was nearly crying. She made another abrupt right turn without signaling on the road that the police station was located on, hoping to lose him. She pulled into the brightly lit police station parking lot and just sat there for a while. The man must have noticed the building she was parked in front of, because he just continued on and parked in the parking lot of an adjacent apartment building and sat there watching her to see her next move. Regretfully, my mum didn't call 911 at this point, mainly because she was frozen with fear. My mum and grandma probably stayed parked at the police station for at least half hour, until the man left and drove off. They didn't leave the police station for at least 15 minutes after that. They never saw the white Escape after this. My mum dropped my grandma off at her house and then drove back home to ours and got no sleep that night. The next morning, my mum called the police and filed a report. They took his description along with his car and said that they would get back to her. Fast forward to Sunday morning. My mum received a call while enjoying Mother's Day drinks with Grandma at our house. It was the sheriff. and apparently he had some news on this stalker. Apparently, he lived in a town 45 minutes southeast of ours in an apartment. He is the real kicker. The apartment hadn't been occupied for at least 3 months. We really don't know where to go from here. The man could literally be anywhere, and that has been freaking the whole family out. We don't know if he somehow found out our address, and the sheriff just told my mum that they would keep watch on our neighborhood for the next few days and told her to call 911 immediately if she sees anything out of place. This event really shook my mum and grandma up, and my dad has been in a near shaking rage over the last 2 days because of it. I just hope we never have to meet that crazed guy. The creepiest moment of my life so far may be tame compared to some of the stuff that you've heard before, but it was still scary nonetheless. Right. Every Saturday, me and a few friends get together to watch UFC. We live in England, so this usually means staying up until the early hours of the morning, followed by a painfully tiring walk home after it's finished. I live on the other side of town to my friends, so whenever we watch it at one of their houses, I have to walk a good 6 to 7 miles to get home, as I can't afford a car. This was never a problem though, because I don't mind walking as long as I've got a bit of music to keep me company. And I was still a naive 17-year-old who thought everyone in my area was friendly and harmless. Needless to say, I was proven wrong. September last year we were watching UFC. I remember it was John Jones versus Rampage because I lost a substantial amount of money on a bet when Rampage got completely dominated. The event went on until around 3 a.m, at which point we all parted ways and set off home. I had made this walk countless times and considered my chosen route perfectly safe, although looking back, it was probably the worst route I could have taken. I basically followed the main road for a mile, and this led to some back alley which led to a 5-mile home straight, consisting of a high road to my right and Forest Park to my left. In the day, the park was really inviting, as it was just swings, slides, and a climbing frame, completely surrounded by a wall of trees. It was like something straight out of Center Parks. However, at night time, with the lack of light, it's a stereotypical, almost Scooby-Doo-like creepy place. I had made it to the home straight without interruption, and everything was going as normal. I remember I was listening to Hit the Road Jack by Ray Charles at the time. I was about 2 miles down the road and just coming up to the dreaded playground when I felt a car coming up behind me with its high beams on. It wasn't uncommon for cars to pass me on my walks home. Minicabs frequently passed me, but it was unusual for their lights to be that bright. I thought nothing of it at first, but the lights stayed on me for way longer than they should have. All I was thinking was, how has this car not overtaken me yet? I took out my headphones and I heard the engine running really slowly, like when you pull a car out a drive. It was at this point I realized the car was literally right behind me. The driver must have seen me notice him because he sped up, so he was going at the exact same as me. Being naive, I thought he probably just wanted directions or something, so I stopped to see what he wanted. As I stopped, so did he. I took out my other headphone and said something along the lines of, "Hey, what's up?" He didn't say anything but just stared at me. He looked like he was in his mid-40s and not of English descent. My best guess was that he was Polish, due to his greyish-white hair, big build, and scruffy appearance. No offense to Polish people, by the way. That's just how a bunch of Polish people that I personally know look like in my area. His blank stare kind of freaked me out, so I just stuck my headphones back and started walking fast down the road. This was far from the end, however, as he again matched my speed, staring at me the whole time, not once looking at the road. As soon as he caught my eye, he gestured me with the "come hither" motion, which accompanied his now grinning face that really freaked me out. I was genuinely panicking at this point and started weighing up my limited options. I could try to run home, but this would mean running in a straight line for 4 miles, which I probably couldn't do for a start. And he would be able to drive alongside me the whole way. So that was a no. I could attempt the freak-out method and try to act crazy to scare him off, but I had already shown signs of fear, so doing this would probably result in a physical confrontation. I can take care of myself just fine in a fair fight, but this guy could have any assortment of weaponry, so that option was a definite no. In the end, I had to go for my third and final option of dart into the forest and hide until he drives away. As much as I didn't want to do it, I jumped over the small ditch between the path and the forest and proceeded to hide in a big jumble of bushes 20 meters in. At this point, my heart was in my throat, and I just sat there staring at the road, waiting for the lights from the cars to disappear. I must have sat there for what felt like an eternity, but it was in fact just a few minutes. But the lights didn't go away. All I could do was plead that the car drove off, and after several more minutes of the lights just staying there, I realized I had to plan another way of getting home, or at least away, and I figured the only way was to make the rest of the way through the forest. But I couldn't move. I was genuinely paralyzed with fear. It took me a minute to compose myself, and then I gradually started shuffling forwards. I didn't care how long it took, I just had to get home. I edged forwards gradually and eventually reached the clearing where the park was. I didn't want to be out in the open, so I was trying to think of the best way to get around the park. It was only then I noticed a black silhouette sitting on the swing with its back to me. It could only be him. He must have gotten out of the car to look for me and was just waiting on a swing. Tears were streaming down my face because I was sure that it was him. Once again, I found myself paralyzed with fear. He hadn't seen me, and I don't think he had heard me either. But the sickening feeling was in my stomach, and he just sat there rocking back and forth. I took a deep breath, and then sprinted as fast as I could back the way I came, back through the forest, and came out on the edge of the road where the home straight had started. I say sprinted, but I felt like one of those dreams where your legs don't work properly, and they just shake and wobble uncontrollably. From there, I ran all the way back to my friend's house. I don't remember much about the journey at all. It felt like 1 second I was in the forest, and the next, I was banging on his door and shaking uncontrollably. He let me in, and his parents called the police, who arrived about an hour or so later. I went to the station to make a report and give a description of the guy, but they never took it any further because my description didn't match anyone of known danger in the area. When my parents found out, they insisted that it be taken further, but the police seemed to think that nothing illegal actually happened, which is fair enough. I guess there's no way of knowing what his true intentions were, but as far as I'm concerned, I thought it was near the end for me that night. It goes without saying that I never walked home at that time of night again, and now I'm a hell of a lot more paranoid when it comes to strangers. About 4 years ago, I was a line cook at a restaurant that was located in a hotel. I worked at this restaurant for nearly 2 years with no problem, walking the half-mile or so distance it took me to reach the bus I took to get home from my job. This restaurant had a partnership with the hotel for late-night room service. So, pretty much every night after closing the restaurant, 1, sometimes 2 line cooks would stay until 3 a.m. preparing simple things like salads, sandwiches, and wraps that would be taken to rooms via hotel employees. Now, me being a recent college graduate in my early 20s would always volunteer for the extra hours. Student loans and rent cost a lot. As I said prior, I had worked this job for a decent amount of time with no problems, except for one rainy night I'll never forget. As I left work at 3 in the morning, I realized I messed up when I forgot an umbrella that day. I now had to make my normal walk under decent rainfall, and after lighting a cigarette and putting in my headphones, I was ready to make my unfortunate journey. I started on my normal routine walking back, cutting through the alleyways I had memorized as my shortcuts through the city. About halfway through my walk, a car started following me with the passenger window down. Aware of my surroundings, I had recognized this, but decided to mind my own business and keep my head down and carry on walking. Growing up in a rough neighborhood taught me better than to put my nose where it doesn't belong. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough. Over the music coming from my headphones, I could hear shouting from the car. I turned to face the car driver but didn't stop walking. He looked at me, a white man in his late 30s or early 40s, with a bandana and sunglasses on. I remember thinking it was odd. He was driving with sunglasses so late at night. "Hey man, where you heading?" I could hear him say. At this point, I took out one earbud and replied, "What's it to you?" To which he answered, "Figured I'd ask. You look like you need a ride to get out the rain." I told the guy I'm all set, and that I was almost at my destination. Now keep in mind, I'm still walking and he's driving slowly next to me, on this side of the street at 3 a.m. "No problem. Do you want to smoke some weed?" At this point, I was annoyed with the guy. I had just gotten done working 13 hours in a kitchen, and all I wanted to do was to listen to some music before bed and unwind. "Nah man, I don't," even though I did. I replied in a stern and obviously annoyed tone. He just looked at me, almost like he knew I was lying. "Have a good night," I said, before replacing my earphone back into my ear and taking the right up a one-way street, losing him in the process. I arrived to my bus stop safely, and with about 10 minutes to spare. I was the only one there, beside one homeless man sleeping on a bench some ways up, and after 3 minutes the car pulls up to the side of the curb, directly in the bus lane. This time I'm facing him. He rolls down the window. "You're heading the south side, huh?" "How do you know?" He points above me. I look up on the digital board and it says the next bus destination and time. "You want a lift? I'm heading that way." At this point I was all set and the hood came out of me. "Hey man, I don't know who you are. I don't want to ride, so just piss off," I said angrily. He stared at me again, but this time I stared back. We locked eyes for a good 20 seconds before the bus approached behind, honking loudly. The guy checked his rearview mirror, rolled up the window and sped off. On the way home, I remember looking back behind me and my surroundings to make sure this creep didn't try and follow me home. Luckily, he didn't, and when I got off the bus, I was in my apartment, safe within 5 minutes. Fast forward a week. One of my buddies who I worked with asked me if I heard about the body that the cops found in a dumpster behind a grocery store, less than 5 minutes from the hotel. I replied, "No." He told me it was the body of a girl that was found strangled to death, and the cops are on the lookout for a killer still at large. The cops have no evidence, and were asking for people to come forward with additional information. I hadn't told my buddy or anyone beside my girlfriend at the time what happened that night. When I told him my story, he insisted I call the cops and tell them what happened. I told him I would, but never did. Called me old school, but like I said earlier, I learned growing up to mind my own business and avoid trouble, and trouble won't find me. So that's what I did. To this day, I haven't heard anything more about the case. I wonder if it was the same guy. I think about how weird it was for him to approach me the way he did, at such an odd hour of the day. The sunglasses, following me to the bus stop. That stuff doesn't normally happen, right? After that experience, I started walking home with my paring knife in my pocket and walked with only one earphone in the whole time so that I could better hear my surroundings. I also stopped volunteering for the overnight shift. Whoever killed that girl, I hope they get caught or has a change of heart. It's crazy how fragile life is. I was walking home from work late one night. I had volunteered to print out some flyers and put them on everyone's desk, as well as some other menial office tasks, as I really needed the money. It must have been close to 10 at this point, and I was just putting everything in my backpack and preparing to leave the door. For context, I'm a guy in my mid-30s and know the city I live in very well. It was a 10-minute walk to my bus stop and then a short bus ride back to my apartment. It's a route I always take, not always this late, but it's very familiar to me. As I'm making my way to the bus stop, I look behind me because I heard someone running. I turn around and there's a guy running really fast. He zooms past me and carries on running round a corner. I think nothing of it and just carry on plodding along to my destination. I keep walking and I look to the left, the road he went down out of interest, and notice that he can no longer be seen. That's funny, I thought, and carry on my way. A little while later, I get to the bus stop, and looking up at the notice board, I see it won't be there for a few minutes. So I stand there anxiously looking around, seeing if by any chance the bus is early. And that's when I see the man. He's no longer running, but now hiding behind a tree watching me. That's weird, I thought. What the hell is he doing? I tried to put it to the back of my mind, and within a few minutes, my bus arrives. I hop on, make my way to the back, and as I sit down, my blood runs cold. The man ran in front of the bus, stopped it, and the bus driver actually opened the doors for him. He hopped in, he didn't look at me, and sat towards the front. Oh crap. Is he following me, I think? Surely not. Like I said, I don't live very far from the bus stop. So I start to wonder, if he's following me, he'd get off at the same stop, right? But there are so many stops on this bus that more likely than not, he won't be getting off. So I come up with the theory. I'm gonna get off at the stop before and bait him. And if he goes to the door, I'll say after you. And then as he gets off, I'll just stay on. I thought it was a clever idea. And as it got to the stop before mine, I got up as if I were going to leave. He obviously took notice, stands up, and is standing by the doors waiting for them to open. As they open, I say in my most customer service voice, "After you, sir." He looks up at me for the first time and walks off the bus. Just as I'm about to get off, I make out like I forgot something. And at that moment, the bus closes the doors and drives off. The guy is still standing at the bus stop, but the smile he had on his face is completely gone. There's a sour look with malice in his eyes as I drive away, staring at him through the window. I knew for a fact he had bad intentions. The bus stop that I got off at was about a mile away, so I doubt he could have made it in time. But still, I power walked home, locked my doors, shut my lights off, and looked out the window just to make sure he wasn't around. I didn't sleep easy that night, but I never saw him again, and I hope I never do. I live in an extremely quiet neighborhood, one that's considered safer than most of the ones surrounding it. One Sunday morning I woke up abruptly early and decided it'd be nice to go for a walk. I live in a very foggy place, so of course there was a lot of mist swirling around. Still, it seemed like a fairly ordinary morning. I ended up walking for about 15 minutes when I noticed that there was literally no one else out on the streets, including cars driving by. My neighborhood is very quiet, and it was super early in the morning, so I thought nothing of it. I'm not really one for walks, as it was very out of character for me to even go for one in the first place, so I opted to turn around and head back home. After a few minutes of walking, I heard the light crackling of gravel behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a disgruntled old man on a bright red bike pedaling in the fog around 20 feet behind me. Thinking nothing of it, I turned forward again and kept walking, assuming that his biking would be faster than my walking and he would pass me. Another minute passed and I turned around in confusion, wondering why the hell he still hadn't overtaken me. My heart skipped a beat, as I realized he was now just 10 feet away, biking at the same speed I was walking. Slightly creeped out now, I decided to just pull over to a bench on the sidewalk and take out my phone to let him pass me by. My heart was beating super fast as he slowly pulled in front of me, but to my relief, he continued to pass, or so I thought. As I got up from the bench, I realized he had simply pulled over at another bench, 10 feet down the sidewalk in front of me, and stationed his bike there. I was hoping he'd go into the nearby building, but he simply stood there staring out into space. Now I was panicking. I sat back down and began texting my friend to tell her what was happening, in the hopes that he'd get back on his bike and pedal away. When I looked back up, he was now 5 feet away from me, still staring off into space. I put my phone up to my ear to pretend like I was speaking to someone, and then I got up from the bench and fast walked past him, back towards my apartment. I half expected him to grab me, but fortunately he let me pass. At this point, I was walking as fast as possible without breaking into a jog, with my phone in my ear. I glanced back again, sure that it was all in my head and he'd be sitting on the bench, but instead found that he had gotten back onto his bike and began to pursue me. Fully creeped out now, I gave up on walking and jogged through an abandoned parking lot that would lead me to a row of restaurants. The man, completely expressionless, kept following me, a bit faster now to match my pace. The parking lot was surrounded by two massive warehouse buildings covering it, more or less from the street view. I was sure this was where he was going, to suddenly speed up and brutally finish me. I made my way to the other end of the parking lot and to the street corner to the restaurants visible just across the way. The "no walking" sign was lit up, and for some reason I decided to obey it, even though there were no cars around. At this point, the man was seriously pedaling towards me, so I finally gave in and dashed across to the restaurants. None of them were open, but one had staff inside. Panting, I stood outside the restaurant, making sure I was within their sight. The man on the bike stood across the street, where I had just been moments before, staring at me. I honestly waited 10 minutes for him to give up and leave, but he didn't move the entire time. Finally, for a split second, he looked away, and I dashed around the corner of the building out of sight. I sprinted all the way back, making sure to take any twists and turns so he wouldn't be able to find me, just by pedaling quickly. I know it may not seem that creepy to some, and that I could have handled the situation better, but I was so shaken in the moment that all of my actions were the first thing to pop into my mind. About a month after that incident, I exited my apartment, which is at the bottom of an extremely steep hill, to head to my Uber. I'd pretty much forgotten about what had happened, but I just happened to look up to the top of the hill, and the same old man was standing at the top, this time without his bike, staring down at me. I got into my Uber and drove away. It's been about a week since then and I haven't seen him since, but I constantly feel like he's gonna pop out and maybe unlock my apartment door and do who knows what. I live in a small college town that was considered the most dangerous city in America per capita not so long ago. There's a whole load of gang violence, drug use, and a ton of awful people. I hate this town. I struggle with clinical depression, and recently, after a long time of doing fairly well, it has hit me again like an express train. This day in particular was very bad. I woke up and immediately just felt horrible. My whole day was just a blur of moping at school, so I ended up skipping my tennis class final hour as it was raining, and I wouldn't be missing out on anything. Days like this, I can just tell my teacher I'm going to the library and just go home. I get home and immediately go on a walk without going inside. Going on walks and working out often makes me feel a lot better on days like this. I live about a mile from the college campus, so typically it's pretty safe. There's always police patrolling, and there are places where you can press a button in case of emergency everywhere on campus. I was just walking, and I get about halfway through the campus after strolling for about 30 minutes, and I decide to turn around and go home. I opt to take a different path home and walk down the street where the off-campus apartments and frats are. After walking, getting about halfway back, I stop. I sit on one of the steps to one of the apartment buildings, and I was there for about 10 minutes just texting my friends and trying to cheer up, when I notice some idiot in a big black pickup with heavily tinted windows drive by very slowly. I thought this was weird, but I just brush it off, thinking it was someone looking for a certain apartment. But about 30 seconds later, I see him pass again. This time I give them a huge death stare because I was getting slightly paranoid. They proceeded to drive past, and I still haven't been able to make out their face. This happens twice more, and I was getting a bit more freaked out. I didn't even look at my phone or call or text anyone because I was panicking, and I didn't want to take my eyes off the road. This time he proceeds to turn around right in front of me and pull up next to me. I'm 17, but I look like I'm 14, and the fact that my hair was wet didn't help. Without my hair being styled, I almost look like I have a bowl cut. They pull up directly next to me and park, with the passenger side next to me. At this moment, I'm freaking out, and I get up. I hear the door open and immediately bolt around the corner of the apartment building and hide. I sit behind a small bush next to the door of a neighboring apartment where I wouldn't be seen. I immediately proceed to call my girlfriend, to no answer. I call my best friend, no answer. And I call my other close friend I met through my girlfriend, and he picks up, which I was surprised about since he hardly ever answers. I couldn't call my mum because I know she would never let me go on walks again, but it's something I genuinely enjoy as it's very therapeutic. I tell them where I am and if something happens to call the cops immediately. My girlfriend calls and I tell them I'm going to talk to her. At this point, I proceed to quietly break down and tell her and make a plan if anything happens. After 8 minutes, I walk out thinking they must have left, but I see the hood of his truck pulling out of the parking lot of the apartments I was originally at. So I stayed out of sight and ran back to where I was before and stayed for another 10 minutes, shaking. I finally get the nerves to get up. I quickly move to a public road and walk home, immensely paranoid the entire time. For days I couldn't look at pickups without my heart racing. I'm over it now. But the guy in the pickup, let's never meet. I'm a female college freshman in my second semester. This happened around the middle of my first semester, when I was unfamiliar with the area around my campus. My friends and I were working on projects after a long day of classes, and it was about 11 p.m. Amanda was really stressed about a project we had, since we were in the same class, and she began to cry. After calming her down, we all decided to grab some McDonald's and take a break, which wouldn't be too hard since our campus was in the middle of the city. The McDonald's that was closest to us was closed, but Brad saw on his phone that there was a 24-hour one a mere 20-minute walk away. Around 7 of us opted to go there, included Amanda and Brad. About 10 minutes into our walk, we realized that we were in an area we hadn't been in before. No problem, it didn't look bad, and there were 7 of us. There weren't too many strangers about as it was quite late. And when we walked, we made sure no one was alone. At one point though, I had walked a little bit ahead of everyone else and had turned around to wait for the others. To my left, I noticed a white car had suddenly pulled over to where I was. It wasn't like the person had known they were going to pull over. It was like out of the blue. Weird, I thought. The person in the white car never rolled down their window nor opened their door, but as my friends passed, it pulled away. Where the car had pulled over, we had to cross the street and began walking along next to the road after crossing. I glanced behind me and I saw the white car again, pulling up next to us. Then I realized that to get where we were going from, where the car had been before, they had to have made a U-turn, so it was obvious it was done intentionally. They roll down the window as we keep walking, and it's an older man, but due to the darkness, I never got a good look at his face. He neither said nor did anything, just stared. We just tell him to leave us alone. He was obviously staring at me. I began to get scared, anxiety rising in my chest. This guy was after me and was targeting me, and I had never been in a situation like this before. I was from a small town where walking after dark was a thing preteens could do without fear. After we pass, his car pulls away again and leaves. At this point, Amanda is walking behind everyone in a protective manner, and Brad is walking to my left so that I'm not near the road. A minute or two later, the white car returns after doing a further U-turn. At this point, he rolls down his window and begins to speak with me and shows me money, probably to try to get me to go into his car. That is what he obviously wanted. He kept gesturing me to get in, and I was just frozen. This guy could be armed. Who knew what he would be capable of? Most of my friends didn't really know what to say, just telling him to piss off, until Amanda, who had been walking behind me, begins to scream at him. Amanda had been raised in the area and obviously knew how to deal with people like this. She yelled at him, telling him to piss off, and that she would fight him if he stepped out the car. It wasn't her words that scared him off, but the attention she was bringing to the situation. He bolted after Amanda made a scene, and Brad gave me his sweatshirt to tie around my waist, as I was wearing shorts and a crop top, which is probably what drew him to me in the first place. During this last encounter, when he was speeding off, Charlie grabbed a picture of this guy's plates. After that situation, we ended up in an even worse area, the kind of area with heroin needles littering the ground, but we didn't have the same kind of issues that we did before. Though I was still quite shaken up and scared of what had happened, I just wanted to go. We got to the McDonald's and found out they weren't even taking customers inside, only drive-through orders. So our goal basically fell flat, and we got harassment instead of chicken nuggets. We took 2 lifts back to our dorm, my group deciding to get cookies on the way back since the restaurant was a place we had known before and trusted. I haven't experienced anything like that or since, and haven't been in that area since, but I still feel a little bit of fear constrict me when I see a white car passing me a bit too slowly on the street, and when I'm in a city area I don't know well. So weirdo in the white car, let's not meet again. This happened when I was a lot younger, and sometimes I still think about it. At the time, I was around 10 years old, going to school in Osaka, Japan. I lived in America, But every summer my mum would take my younger sister and I to Japan to see her mother and make us go to school, since Japanese schools go on until late July before their summer break. In the mornings, I would walk to school with my sister, and everything was usually okay. Although we'd get the occasional odd stare, since despite being half Japanese, in a smaller town like that, where no tourists ever come, we stuck out like a sore thumb. However, once school was over, I usually was unable to walk home with my sister because of after-school clubs and the clubs ending at different times. At least, I had a few friends who could walk me home, however, and gave me company, so I rarely was ever alone. But one day, I decided I didn't want to stay for my club, and that I just wanted to go home early and play some Wii. I knew my mum wouldn't mind, since I had decided to join a not-too-important club called Cooking Club. My friends, however, had more obligation than I did, since they actually lived in Japan and went for the whole school year, unlike me, and could not accompany me home. My walk home started out fine, but rather quickly my 10-year-old self felt that something was off. There was a man in a baseball cap, wearing one of those cold masks, with baggy clothes following me. He was still a fair distance away from me too, so since I was a pretty naive kid, I shrugged it off and kept walking. But pretty soon after, I heard footsteps pretty close behind me now. I figured it was a different person, but being curious, I turned my head to see the same man closing the distance between us fairly quickly. I remember starting to feel pretty nervous at that point. A quick point here before I continue. In the town I was at, there are lots of small alleys and streets that are all connected, so you can take plenty of wrong turns and still end up home as long as you have a decent idea of where your house is. My brain does not function well at all when I'm nervous or stressed, so instinctively I turned into a small alleyway, which was honestly the dumbest thing I could have done. But at the time I figured that the man would keep walking and that would resolve all of this. But instead, he turned into the alleyway as well. At this point I started fast walking, but didn't want to straight up run since I still wasn't 100% sure he was following me, and running would come off as kind of rude if the man wasn't following me. I began making random turns into streets and narrow alleys that I had never stepped foot into before, hoping that the man wouldn't follow me. Surely he was just an innocent man trying to get somewhere. However, even my dumb 10-year-old brain knew that after the 5th or 6th time I had made a random turn with the man still following me, that I was in danger. At the time, I was in a narrow alleyway with walls that were way taller than I was, so I couldn't see what was up ahead or next to me. I decided I should start running, not thinking that a grown man would be faster than me. I also was weighed down by my backpack and water bottle, so I can only imagine how slow I was. I could hear his footsteps much louder against the asphalt, and I was beyond scared at this point. I was sure I was going to get kidnapped and then murdered. I remember running with everything I had, to the point I was afraid I would literally run myself into the ground. But the alleyway went out into a street I recognized, where there was a supermarket, and thankfully several people were either walking or on their bicycles. I slowed down immediately. I was a self-conscious kid and didn't want to attract more attention to myself than my foreign looks already were. I turned around once more to see the man who was simply standing there for a few moments before walking in the direction of the supermarket. But I knew there was no way that was his destination this whole time. I had taken the weirdest route, and there were much more direct ways he could have used if he had wanted to go there. I told my mum, who contacted the school. I got in trouble for deciding to go home alone that day, and afterwards, a teacher always made sure there was at least one kid with me when I made my way home. I had a friend called Alicia. My town is mostly quiet. Not much happens around here, so when I'm walking around, I don't feel like I'm in any danger. My town park has a section to the side which has hedges in the shape of a square, just over a meter high with some gravel. A statue and two benches facing each other about 10 plus meters away from each other. So because it has a statue, it's called the Memorial Park. Most dog walkers don't go in that area because a lot of people sit there and there isn't much room to throw a ball. Not to mention, there was a huge field-size area for dog walkers and anyone else to go just behind us. Me and my friend just sat on a bench talking when this old guy with a dog trailing behind him comes into the memorial area. I must mention that me and my friend were sat in that area because I, at the time, was deathly afraid of large dogs, so I had my eye on him. The second he walked in there, he starts throwing the ball for his dog to chase. Nothing too strange yet, apart from the fact he kept staring me down, and when we made eye contact, didn't look away. My friend looked over to him, then back to me, and each time the ball is thrown, it got closer and closer to me. Both the man and my friend can both see me visibly flinch and tense every time the dog runs to the ball. My friend took one last look at the man and suggested we leave. Now, there is one entrance/exit to the Memorial Park area. We didn't want to walk past him because he was stood next to the exit, so we chose to leave through the gap in the hedges in the back, which was made from so many people forcing their way through that area. The guy follows us through the gap at a distance. Seeing as it was almost time to go home, me and my friend start heading towards the town center. The guy and his dog, who was now on a lead in front of us, I clearly remember my friend taking quick looks at the guy as we walked and her saying in hurried whispers that he was staring at me. We walked through the town center and walked to the bottom of the road where me and my friend would have to part ways. We stopped to talk about what I saw out the corner of my eye, and the man's pace visibly slowed. At this point, we had been walking around 10 to 15 minutes. He walked past us slowly and looked at me in the eyes and then turned and started walking up the road. I was going to have to walk down it, and my friend insisted she would walk me home just to be safe, and because her curfew was later than mine, she was lucky in that regard and would help me out. He walked not far in front of us the whole walk to my house, his head only occasionally turning to look back at us every few minutes. Me and my friend stood on my doorstep and spoke while he walked a little further down the road. Then he turned in the direction of my house, then got out his phone and started doing something on it. I watched as my friend walked away on a different road from the man to make sure he didn't follow her. Once she was out of sight, I rushed into my house and upstairs into the bathroom. I opened the window slightly and watched the man take one last look at my house and then walk away. The scary thing is, because it was almost 3 years ago, I can't remember what his face looks like. So if I did see him again, who knows if I would recognize him. I'm just glad he hasn't come stalking my house, at least as far as I'm aware. I'm a 16-year-old girl living in rural Virginia. The neighborhood I live in is in the woods and very safe. A few months back, I was walking home from the bus stop. It's about a half-mile walk from the bus stop to my house, but I don't mind walking at all. I live in the forest, and the trees were beautiful that day with beautiful weather. Field hockey practice was cancelled also, so it made walking home that much sweeter. Well, with us living out in the forest a ways away from anything urban or suburban for that matter, our little community is constantly expanding and in turn seeing new houses being built. I lived on a dead-end road with my house at the bottom of a hill, so our house is pretty shielded by the slope and surrounding trees. Just a few days before this creepy encounter, a construction company had begun to clear a lot on the other side of the road further down. At this time, they had orange tape bordering the lot, so no extensive clearing had been started yet. But as I walked home and started to walk down the road leading up to my house, I saw a tan truck pull up on the side of the road. Even months later, I can vividly recall that it had extremely tinted windows. You couldn't even see into the vehicle, let alone the driver. At first, I didn't think much of it, but once I got within 20-ish feet of it, the truck turned on its headlights and began to back up as I got closer. I am naturally a jumpy, paranoid person, so I immediately walked off the road and was onto a lawn, trying to put distance between the truck and myself. At first, I thought it was merely a coincidence that the truck just happened to back up as I got closer. But the moment I began to walk past it, the driver started to back up at an angle, positioning the rear end of the truck right in my path, putting the truck at an angle that effectively blocked the entire road. Now I began to panic a little. I quickened my pace and walked into my neighbor's yard, walking from that yard to the next. Once I had sidestepped the truck, it had stopped altogether, just sitting there in the middle of the road with its headlights on. At that moment, I knew the truck was indeed following me. I couldn't show the driver which house was mine, and still staring at the tanned truck, I walked from yard to yard, passing over driveways but never going onto the road. I walked past my house once, but made sure that I didn't look at it or give any indication that it was mine. After what seemed like minutes, the truck began to drive away, but very, very slowly. Once it drove up the street nearby, a few hundred feet or so, it stopped again to, I assume, see if I'd go into a house. I didn't. I stood there beside a trash can and stared at it, and after a minute or two, the truck finally drove off. I realized looking back that it could have just been someone looking at the lot undergoing construction, but it doesn't shake the uneasy feeling. I can't forget how utterly tinted those windows were, and how it literally followed me. I regret not getting the license plate, especially since I had a huge opportunity to, but at the moment, the thought didn't cross my mind. All I cared about was getting away from the truck and protecting my house. I also learnt that safety is indeed in numbers. At the time of this encounter, I was taking the less traveled route because there were less kids. The scenery was beautiful, it was quiet, and less cars traveled that route. Now when I walk home, I walk with the rest of the kids, and always keep an eye out for that truck. To the person in the tan truck, let's never meet. I work night shifts at a women's shelter that is about a 30-minute commute away from my apartment. I take the metro every night to work and every morning from work. The closest metro station being situated a 5-minute walk from my apartment. My work is situated in the downtown area of the city that I currently reside in while I live in the neighborhood that has a reputation of being filled with alcoholics and drug addicts. I have had no encounters worth mentioning in either places until now. I was walking towards the metro station last night after saying goodbye to my boyfriend who was heading home after spending the evening with me. I think it's worth mentioning that my boyfriend drives to and from my place every Tuesday and Thursday, and I work from Sunday to Wednesday, meaning that I was heading to work when this happened. I was walking towards the metro station when a man suddenly appeared out of nowhere on the street corner, across from the metro station and grabbed me by the arm. This happened to be on the only street corner from my apartment to the metro station that you cannot see anything on the street perpendicular to the one I was on until you got onto the street corner. So I'm getting onto the street corner. The metro station is across from me, and I am getting ready to cross the street as there was a green light when the man appeared out of nowhere and grabbed me by the arm. I freeze for a second before noticing that he is reaching over my body to grab my other arm, but before he could do that, I reacted and elbowed him in the stomach. I guess he didn't expect a quick reaction because he quickly let go. After he let go, I sprinted across the street and ran into the metro station. The metro station has two entrances that are parallel to one and another. Both are facing the turnstiles that access the metro downstairs. I had noticed from the corner of my eye that the guy had followed me, and before he got inside, I headed to the other exit, ran around the station, and headed back towards my apartment. Since I live in the Great White North and it had been snowing all day, I was hoping that my boyfriend had not left yet, as he would have to take the snow off his car before leaving. Luckily, he did not, and he ended up driving me to work. We also met a cop car as we were about to turn on the street to get to the highway, so we stopped and reported the guy. The cops took down my information and what I could remember of his description, and they promised to go check it out and do a few rounds around the metro station. I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but I hope I never encounter that guy ever again. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was a naive 22-year-old. I had been downtown drinking at a bar, catching up with old friends from high school, when the pub closed for the night, and we went back to a friend's apartment. We had a few drinks, and before we knew it, it was 4 a.m. She offered me a place on the couch, but I had to waitress at 4 the next day, so I wanted to be home and do some errands before work. I thought I grabbed a $20 bill for a cab fare in case, but it turns out I only grabbed a $5, so opted for the bus. She lived about a 15 to 20 minute walk from the closest bus stop that I needed, so I left her place and began making my way. I was well aware of the dangers of this choice, but being a very young, naive girl, I assumed it would turn out okay, since I had been in similar situations before. I called my boyfriend at the time, and that possibly could have been a decision that saved my life that night. As I'm walking over this detour bridge downtown, I was telling my boyfriend, "It's going really well. I haven't seen a single person since I started walking." Shortly after I said that, I hear footsteps running. I look up to the part of the bridge that I was walking on and paused. Mid-run, directly in front of me, was this guy staring right into my eyes. He was panting slightly from the running. He didn't look like he was drunk, but his eyes were so wide, and I'll never forget that image for the rest of my life. I kept walking, trying to keep as calm as possible. I loudly say to my boyfriend what had just happened, and describe his physical appearance as best I can, and as loudly as I could, and told him my location. I also said, "If I stop talking to you for even 30 seconds, call the police and tell them everything I just told you." I decided to look back to see if he was following me, and sure enough, off to the side of the path I was on under a streetlight, he was there, a completely black silhouette that was this guy, standing stiff as a board facing me. I thought my heart was already racing, but that sight nearly gave me a heart attack. I walked faster, and after a minute I looked back over my shoulder, and he was in the exact same pose, just closer now, and under a different light post. At this point I had two options: continue on the path I was on, or make a run for it under this underpass that was extremely well lit. So I ran. I've been playing soccer and track all through high school, so I had some advantage. As I was in the underpass, I heard him sprint. I remember thinking, if you look back now, it could slow you down, but at least you'd know if he's following you or not. So I looked. I looked in time to witness him sprint past the lit area I was in. No time to rest, because I assumed he was looking to head me off somewhere, so I kept running until I reached a very busy and populated bus stop. As I was resting, from 3 to 4 blocks away, I saw him walking and look around everywhere, I assume looking for me. I got home and immediately called the cops, and one finally showed up to my apartment at 8 a.m. He took a statement, but there wasn't much they could do other than watch the area and keep his physical description in their database. The scariest part when I look back, over the whole course of the ordeal, I never saw him move until I made a run for it. It was like he was some kind of mannequin. So creepy late night stalker, let's not meet again. This really unnerving event occurred a few weeks ago, and I have to admit, I'm still a little paranoid. As a 16-year-old girl, the 5 friends that were with me during that day are the same age and all female. We all decided to hang out at my house that day, considering we all haven't been with each other since the summer started. It was early afternoon by the time everyone had arrived. We were all having fun playing video games, chatting, and watching videos for the first few hours. A little later, as we sat through some quiet and awkward moments of boredom, one of my friends suggested we should go outside somewhere. Our first thought was to walk to a nearby grocery store, but that was immediately eliminated off the list, since it was going to be a 10 to 15 minute walk in 90-degree Fahrenheit heat. I spoke up, saying there's a small park only a few minutes away from my house. We all agreed to the idea, getting ourselves ready to head out. As I tell my mum where we're going, I lock the door behind us and start walking. We spend the last hour at the park. We're all exhausted, while at the same time not ready to leave just yet. We settle down at a picnic table and passed time chatting until one of my friends noticed a red car parked on the side of the street a little ways away from us, at the very front of the park. I didn't think anything of it at first, until she mentioned the man inside was repeatedly looking over at us. We thought it was odd, but nothing harmful. Still, we decided to leave, taking a different route home just in case. We arrived at the same street my house was on, relieved that we didn't see the same car, but anxious that it could appear again at any moment. It seemed like our suspicions were confirmed. The car then drove by us slowly, the man inside getting a closer look at us as we got a closer look at him and his vehicle. He was African American, slim, wearing a white baseball cap and muscle top, and driving a red 2003 Honda CR-V. He stopped adjacent to my house, out of all places. I was now unsure of what to do. One of my friends told me to call my parents, and I reluctantly complied. He called my dad and asked him to get us outside the house. He was slightly confused, but he agreed to do so anyway. And a few seconds later, I saw my dad on our front lawn, and we rushed over to him to tell him about the red car that was still parked near us. He ushered us inside, all while keeping an eye on the creepy man. We all sat down to take a rest, as my dad was taking pictures of the car and license plate. We were all discussing what just happened, and one of my friends apparently noticed something we did not. According to her, when the man parked his car, leaned back in his seat, he had his phone facing us through his rear window, and he was staring at us through his rear view mirror. It made me feel so sick and disgusted, wondering what that guy planned on doing with the photos and videos he took of us. We continued observing the same car that was in the same place for another 10 minutes, until my dad started pulling out of the driveway to leave for work. My dad started driving in the car's direction, and the creep booked it out of there, fearing the possible confrontation. My friends and I released a sigh of relief when we all returned to having a fun afternoon. At least now I have a picture of the car and the license plate, so I can identify it. I haven't seen the man ever since, and I hope it stays that way. It was Halloween night, and I was 11. My mum had taken me to my cousin Lucy's house to trick or treat, because a few kids from my school lived on her street. Also, her closeted gay friend was with her, but we would all joke that we thought they were dating. He had a girlfriend before, but I think this was before he knew he was gay. We were allowed to walk quite a distance from my cousin's house, probably further than most older kids would or should for that matter. We trick-or-treated for a while and decided to make our way to the local Tesco, which is a local supermarket, to get a pumpkin as they were usually cheapest on Halloween night. On our way, we noticed a grown man in normal clothes besides one of the extra gruesome Halloween masks made seemingly just so adults can scare kids. It was an incredibly mutilated and bloodied face. He was hiding amid some bushes, but it seemed like he wanted us to see him. I remember thinking it was weird because he definitely seemed old, judging by his hands, so he wasn't just a teenager. I realized he seemed like one of these old sad dudes that get some perverse joy out of scaring little kids. When we had come out of the shop, we had a pumpkin each because they were so cheap. We saw the guy had moved to a closer bush and was tilting his head like something out of a horror movie. We laughed it off and walked back to Lucy's house. Just before we reached Lucy's street, we stopped for some reason. I think we were laughing at a joke or something, and then, as I was at the back of the group, I noticed the creepy guy was right behind us with his arms raised, and then made an attempt to grab me, but I stepped back. Not too exaggerated to the point he was obviously joking, but to the point it wasn't entirely obvious whether he was playing a simple prank or was absolutely insane. I assumed since he'd followed us home it was Lucy's dad, Ricky, with some fake old guy gloves, so I just turned around and said, "Uncle Rick," as my friend bolted away, and I soon followed. We got to Lucy's house and told our parents, and they seemed very concerned for some reason. A few years later, my dad told me that a guy on Lucy's street had been arrested before he moved there. So my dad and Rick threatened him that if he ever came near us, they would take care of him. I assume this was an empty threat, although I do know how tough and protective dads can be. But I think that weirdo thought it was an empty threat too. I've always wondered if it was him and what would have happened to me and my friends. So, creepy guy, let's not meet again. I lived quite close to my school in primary, so my older sister and I would walk home because my parents worked. My sister is 5 years older than me, so my parents trusted her enough to leave us home alone instead of going to after-school care. One day when I was in 3rd grade, I was asked by my teacher to stay back at the end of school. I told my sister, and she said she would just go home and wait there. I should also mention that the way from home from school was pretty much along a main road, and it should have been fine. I head back to my classroom and start talking with the teacher. At this point, it was nearly 5. I'm only about halfway home when I notice the white pickup following me. I was only about 7, mind you, and you start being taught stranger danger and stuff like that, so it was still pretty fresh in my mind. The pickup gave off suspicious vibes, and the street felt empty. I remember it still being bright out, but this pickup was the only car on the road. Worse still, it wasn't even on the road. It was on the side, moving very slowly behind me. At this point, it was a red alarm in my young mind, as even then I was pretty cautious of everything. I looked back again, and this time I think whoever it was knew I was aware of them. This was bad, because I think they panicked and were driving a little quicker now to close the gap. I was also getting more panicked too. Then I remember thinking there's a path between the next houses. It leads to the back of other people's homes, and then to the street next to mine. I walk a little faster, and I guess they noticed too. I remember them speeding up a little bit, but still keeping a gap. I quickly turn down between the houses and start running as soon as I think I'm out of their sight. I hear the pickup go faster and then come to a stop. By now I've turned the corner and hid so they couldn't see me. I hear the doors swing open, and I just hoped they wouldn't follow. I hear someone step on the grass. They were following, and I was panicking. Just then a voice says that they should just leave and forget about it. They speed away, and I walk the rest of the way home. Now, you might be thinking, what made me think of this just now? Well, a while ago, I heard my parents talking about some pretty dark stuff that was shut down on the internet, out of the Gold Coast in Queensland. I step in to ask what they were talking about, and they said that when I was a kid it came out on the news that the police had taken down a huge CP website. I then went and searched this up, and turns out that the guy in charge of the website ran it out of the suburb I lived in. I got chills reading the article. Remembering back, this all happened 2 years after the van incident. 29 kids were saved from abuse that were featured on that website. It just really gives me the chills to think that maybe the guy in the pickup truck was one of them. This happened a few years ago when I was still living with my mum, and I had borrowed her car to go see my then boyfriend for the evening. It was around midnight when I got back to my neighborhood, so the roads were empty. And that's when I noticed this dirty, run-down, rusted white utility van that a maintenance guy would drive, following me. I never even saw the driver's face, but I got this immediate sinking feeling in my stomach because something felt wrong about this van. Now, I was only 20 at the time, but I knew better than to just drive straight to my house and letting this person know exactly where I lived, no matter how desperately I wanted to just go home and ignore it. But I also wasn't 100% sure they actually were following me yet. I didn't want to jump to conclusions just because it was late and I was alone and paranoid. So I drove to a shopping complex a few minutes out the way that's well lit and has a public library to see if I was followed there. I thought I lost the van, but decided to wait in the parking lot a few minutes because I had a bad feeling I couldn't shake. Sure enough, the van showed up and was driving in random circles around the parking lot, looking for me. This scared me quite a bit, so I drove towards the big mall that's always got security police presence. Because it was the midway point between where I was and where I lived, I parked in a pretty well-lit, although empty, 24-hour McDonald's parking lot, where I had a great view of the roads and the mall. But I wasn't super easy to spot, and waited to see if the van showed up looking for me. It did, and of course, this would be the only time the security and the cops are nowhere to be found, which is half the reason I decided to head there in the first place. Realizing whoever was driving this van was 100% actively following me in the middle of the night, I knew just driving home was not an option, and that's a terrifying realization. Luckily, the police station is just a few minutes away from where I was, so I try and discreetly drive away, hoping the van hadn't noticed me yet. I wasn't that lucky, because it wasn't before long that it was in my rearview mirror once more. At this point, I'm panicking pretty hard and my anxiety is high. I finally pulled into the police station parking lot, and seconds later the van came to a stop in the middle of the road for no more than a few seconds. I'm guessing just long enough for them to realize where I'd led them and took off really fast immediately. I did make it home safe and without seeing the van again, not long after, but this whole ordeal took less than an hour of my night up. It was after 1 a.m. by the time I made it home, and I was terrified the entire time. I don't know what this guy's specific intention was, but honestly I don't need to know. I know it was nothing good and I likely avoided a very bad situation. If you think someone is following you, it's not stupid or paranoid to make sure you aren't right. Who knows what might have happened if I'd have led him to my house or gotten out of the car. I was a 13-year-old girl, and an early bloomer, if you know what I mean. And I'm pretty tall for my age, so I looked older than I really was. Normally at the bus stop, when it was nice out, I would go to pick up my little brother from school, since I got out of school before he did, and it's about 20 houses down. I would always take my dog Caesar with me because he loved the attention and a good walk. I wouldn't say we lived in a good area, but by no means it's horrible trash. Across the street from our bus stop is a blue house that had been listed on the sex offenders register. The people that lived there consisted of 4 white men that were the definition of white trash. Their ages ranged from 18 to 45. There was also an old lady who was in her 60s and 70s. She always had her grandsons over, but he technically didn't live there, and she always drove these guys everywhere. One day I'm waiting at the bus stop with Caesar, while 4 of them were outside, 2 playing basketball, the oldest man sitting in a lawn chair drinking a beer, and smoking a cigar with one of the younger guys. I was on my phone, and being the protective person I am, carried a small weapon in my back pocket. This older man sets his beer down and puts out his cigar. He walks across the street to come close to me, and I discreetly backed up a little. I just thought he was waiting for the kid that visited the old lady every week. I think he is her grandson, but I really don't know. He comes closer to me and asks to pet my dog. At this point, my dog is starting to growl. I say sure because I was very awkward at this age, and try to get my dog to sit, but my dog is full on barking at this guy and won't stop. After a few minutes I say sorry he won't calm down, maybe later, and he looks at me for the first time, because he'd only been looking behind me the whole time. He smiles, and it was so creepy it sent chills down my spine. When I think about it now, he says it's alright, maybe next time you're here. He winks, walks away and keeps clenching his fists, so hard his knuckles turn white. After he walks away, Caesar calms down a little, and he starts sniffing behind me. There are 2 huge trees and another row of houses behind me. He keeps pulling, so he sees a squirrel, which he only growls at, and then he starts barking at the tree. I walk him over to the actual bus stop, which is at the corner, and he finally calms down. A few minutes later, I hear footsteps behind me, and I turn around and see the guy run out from behind one of the 2 big trees, and I immediately recognize him as the 4th guy from the house. Sadly, on November 7th, 2017, Caesar passed away at age 5 due to a cancerous tumor that spread to his lungs. I don't know what would have happened if my dog wasn't there to save me, but I'd rather not meet those creepy guys from across the street from my bus stop again. I live in an area of New York City which is notorious for crime and gang violence and the sort. My parents are poor, struggling Asian immigrants, so we had no choice to be living where we are. For context, I'm a 17-year-old female, and even though my neighborhood is seemingly dangerous, I never truly internalized that idea. I've always been able to walk the 2 blocks away from the train station alone, without an ounce of fear. I could walk slowly, freely, and even listen to music as I walked home. Today, my carefree attitude came crashing down as I walked up the first block. I was listening to music before I met a strange man, clearly in his 30s. His hair was disheveled under his baseball cap, and he was wearing the stereotypical ghetto clothing. We were going in opposite directions, and as I passed him, he suddenly brushed his hand against my stomach as he hollered out, "Hey, sexy." Immediately, I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, confused as to why he touched me. I tried to ignore it, assuming he wouldn't follow me or anything, but I was wrong. He completely turned around and started lingering behind me. "How are ya? Can I take you home? I'm gonna make you mine tonight." I just kept walking faster, but he kept following me. As a 17-year-old who's never experienced anything like this, I had no idea what to do. All I could think about was getting him away from me. Couldn't he tell I was a kid? As I took longer and longer strides in an attempt to get away from the creep, I thought of everything I could do. I would have to take a turn soon, and I knew that block would put me in more danger since it was usually empty. Thankfully, there was a grocery store near that turn, and a woman in her 20s who I made eye contact with. I walked up to her and gave her a look she could immediately tell by that something was bothering me. As soon as he saw me go up to that woman, he decided to stop and walk into the grocery store. I was still scared to take the turn, but the woman reassured me that she would watch him and told me to go safely. My legs were shaking from the experience, and I am forever disillusioned with the safety of my neighborhood. How naive was I to think I would actually be safe on those streets? I hope to not meet again. I was at a graduation party when I was 18 that lasted late, but not too late. I drove home, and I live in a small area that's not uncommon for all the parking spots to be full and everyone to be asleep in my street that late. I was the only car I saw on my way home. When I pulled up, I parked in front of our driveway as if I were blocking it, and saw ahead at the intersection at the end of the block. There was a car stopped at the stop sign, facing my block, idling. I knew a girl I went to school with who lived in the house next to where the car was stopped, so figured they were just waiting at the stop sign for her, as there were no parking spots free. I'm also a super cautious person and always think people are following me. So I was going to wait in my car until the car left, but I noticed my phone had died on the way home. It was my first cell phone, and car chargers weren't huge in my family until this. Usually I'd call my brother, who was a year younger than me, to come out and walk with me inside, but I couldn't do that. I waited for 10 minutes, and the car didn't move. It was switched on, the lights were on, and I was freaking out. I finally got the nerve to just get out the car and run. My house was right there, and I positioned my keys so that I could just unlock the door as quickly as possible. As soon as my door opened, I took a step out the car, and my car light went out when the car across the intersection floored it. I heard the tires squeak and everything. The car was clearly waiting for me to make a move. I saw it pull up and waited till I got out. I don't even know how it happened, but I managed to pull myself back into the car, turn on the car, and reverse out the spot that I had parallel parked in, and pull out, just as the back passenger window of this car met my window. Everything was tinted. I missed the driver window trying to leave, so I didn't see anything of who it could have been. Once I was driving again, I was sobbing. My phone was out of charge, and I didn't know what to do. I considered going back to the party, but eventually I just circled my blocks enough times that I was able to connect every car in the area with my neighbors, so I felt comfortable enough to go back home. I'd never run out of my house so quickly in my life. My mom worked nights as a nurse, so I didn't bother waking my brother or stepdad up. I charged my phone, called my mum sobbing, and she was so upset, she screamed at my stepdad, whose car I was driving, for not having a car charger. Which was not the problem, but I see Mama Bear trying to control whatever she could. To this day, 7 years later, if I'm driving at night, I tell my mum when I'm home. It's such a safe town, and I've never heard of anything like this happening since. When I was little, I walked home from the bus stop after school. I did this every day, and I thought that my neighborhood was completely safe. Everyone there was usually very nice. Plus, the bus stop was only a block or so away from my house at the time, so it was a short distance. I hadn't realized that at the time, but a lot of people had been taken, and attempts to take people were going on in the area. The school sent out the obligatory emails and phone calls informing the parents of the situation, but it hadn't yet reached me. So one day I'm on my merry way home and notice a blue truck heading in the opposite direction. I shrug it off, as cars always passed me whenever I walked home. Though the truck turned around at the first corner it could, I thought it strange, but I tried to rationalize it. They probably forgot something. I was wrong. The truck was now going in the same direction as I was also going around the same speed I was, and this weirded me out, so I pick up the pace. I could hear the truck's engine accommodated the speed slightly, with it picking up as well. After that, I booked it. I ran as quickly as I could to my home, and I could hear the truck's engine roar as it got faster. I somehow made it back to my house, slammed the locks on the door as quickly as possible, and was so grateful that my mum left the door unlocked that day, especially since I'd been trying to have her leave it locked so that I could use my new house key. I don't know if they were targeting me or not, but I'm glad I didn't get to find out. This story takes place when I was 17 years old. It was the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. I had just gotten my license and car, and finally gotten my first taste of adult freedom. So, naturally, I abused it. I would sneak out at night and go hang out with boys in the neighboring town, and come back in the early hours of the morning. I felt pretty badass, to say the least. One night, I was driving home at around 2 a.m. To get back from my neighboring town, you have to drive through our old military base. It's not abandoned or anything, and has multiple businesses and banks, and there is a section of it with light-up signs to a walking trail. This little area has a small lot for people to park their cars while they run, bike, or whatever they wish to do on the trail. As I drive on base, I see a car in the lot. I admittedly don't know anything about makes or models of cars, but I can tell you that it was a car, and that it was black. Its lights are on, and when I drive past it, it leaves the lot and begins to follow me. I didn't consciously think too much of this, as I assumed it was just some teenagers smoking or fooling around that got spooked by my car passing through. As I approached the lights that led into my city, I put my blinker on to turn right, and so does the car behind me. Again, I did not think much of this, as to get to a large portion of my city, you need to make a right turn at said light. Now at this point, there are absolutely no other cars on the road. It was very late at night, and my city goes dead after about 11 p.m. So after checking in my rear view and making sure the plates were not a cop's, I start to speed to get home quicker, going around 10 over the legal limit. As I do this, so does the car behind me. At this point, I start to feel uneasy. I continue to speed up, and so does the car. When turning onto my street, there is a left turning lane to get into. I decide in a split-second decision to just turn onto my road without slowing down or turning on my blinkers, to see what the car would do. They did not initially follow, and as I approached my house, I still felt like something was off. Sure enough, the car had turned around to continue following me down my road. I started to freak out. I knew that I was being followed. I'm a little 17-year-old blonde girl in a Mini Cooper with no self-defense. And I can't call my parents because then they would know I snuck out. And I can't call the police because it was past 9. As it's illegal to without an enhanced license before you turn 18 in NYS. And I was terrified to get a ticket. I couldn't even go downtown to the police station as there were too many stops and lights that I didn't want to be stuck in with this person. So I called my aunt, who lives around 5 to 10 minutes from my house, and start driving in her direction. The car obviously follows, and my aunt says to come to her house as fast as I can, and she would be out there with her pit bull, Belle, who is a sweetheart but looks like she could kill someone. As I'm driving up the country road to her house, I speed faster and faster, and the car continues to match my speed. I ended up going at about 100, and they do the same. I go into fight or flight mode, and I push my car to as fast as it would take me, as I go up the final hill to my aunt's house, and had a fast and furious tire screeching moment, as I quite literally whipped into my aunt's development. I could not see the car following me down the hill, because I was going so fast. I immediately run into her house. When I arrive, we lock all the doors and windows, and she goes to bed after 10 minutes. But I stay up, adrenaline still rushing. From her guest bedroom, you can see out into the street. I kept peeping through the windows to make sure the car did not come back. To my horror, a few minutes after my aunt went to bed, I saw the same car slowly circling the neighborhood, briefly slowing down outside my aunt's house, presumably once they saw my car. Luckily, they did not stop and left the neighborhood after that. I don't think I've ever been more scared in my life. My city is small, and I did not recognize the car, so I truly do not believe it was a prank. I wish I had called the police or gotten plates, but I wasn't thinking straight, and I'm glad nothing bad happened that night, and that whoever was driving the car did not catch up to me, or God knows what they wanted to do. I might be overreacting, but I plead and hope to never meet the driver or occupant of that car ever again. This happened to my Aunt Clara about 20 years ago. She was a regular at a bowling club. As you can imagine, bowling isn't a super popular sport, but attracts its own unique crowd nonetheless. She usually got a lift from her husband, and was picked up at roughly around 10. However, on this night, her husband had been called back to work for an emergency at the plant where he worked. He was pissed, but it wasn't too much trouble for my aunt, because the walk back to her house was nothing more than about 15 minutes. She thanked all the members offering her rides, and said that she would be fine, as another member took her balls and said that he would bring them next time. It's not like she could bowl when she was at her house anyway. So, she got her stuff and made her way home. And as the bowling alley was at the edge of town, it teetered off to become the sticks almost. She started her walk fairly pleasantly, and about halfway, she saw someone in the distance. She thought it was a guy trying to break into the car, so instinctively decided to cross the road and pretend not to notice. She tried to ignore him as much as possible, but he had no intention of ignoring her. He immediately stopped what he was doing, and my aunt said she heard a metallic clang as something fell to the ground, and heard the man literally run across the pavement and road over to her. He got right behind her, and she could hear his breath loud as he had just run a short distance dangerously close to her neck. She was scared and unsure if she should turn around and say something or be polite, but chose to remain oblivious. Not 3 seconds had passed when my aunt felt his hand rest gently on her shoulder. She turned around, and he was there panting, and offered her a big smile, and said, "Hello, where are you off to?" She gave her a wry smile, and said that she was just making her way to see a friend. He looked at her, and she could see this kind of crazed look in his eyes. There was something weird about his pupils, but she couldn't really tell what. He said, "Can I come too? I need a friend tonight." She didn't really know what to say. On the one hand, she could be polite and try and lose him halfway there, and on the other, she could be rude and potentially face the consequences of a pissed off guy who she didn't know, who she was pretty sure she'd just seen trying to break into a vehicle with a crowbar. So she chose to be nice and said, "Of course." The guy smiled again and put his hand on her shoulder as they started walking. The man was a fair bit bigger than my aunt, so she relented and walked the death march with this creepy guy. She was no more than 5 minutes from her house and needed to find a way to lose him. Problem being, her house was on this very road, so there was no way for her to lose him really, unless she cut off another road and went around in a circle. But then what if he didn't follow? She'd lead him right back to where she didn't want him to be. All these thoughts entered her mind as she walked ever closer to her front door. She made a tactical move and just kept on walking. The guy was starting to get bored as my aunt wasn't saying much, and kept asking how far it was and if it would be much further. She said that it was just up here, and then picked a random house with all the lights off. She said that this is where her friend lived. She was getting desperate and feeling incredibly anxious. It was only 10. She knew some people could be in bed at this time, but she wished on her lucky stars that there'd be no one home. I'm not sure why. She knocked on the door with the guy in tow, waiting to see what would happen. There was no reply. After about 2 minutes of waiting in silence, the guy goes, "Looks like there's no one home." She turns back and says, "What night is it tonight?" He says, "Thursday." And she goes, "Oh man, there's me thinking that it was Friday. I'm so sorry, my friend. Well, no harm done. Looks like we won't be going anywhere after all. I better get home now. Hope you have a good night," and started walking along. But he caught up fairly quickly, unrelenting and unprepared to leave her be. "That's all right. Why don't we chill back at your place?" That's when things got creepier. His hand started descending her shoulder and all the way down to her waist. She instinctively slapped his hand off and told him that that wasn't cool, but he then gave a very, very angry look, and she started to feel very threatened. In a moment of panic, she dropped her purse intentionally so that things would start falling out. She saw a lipstick of hers begin rolling down the sidewalk, and as she was picking things up, she looked behind her and indicated to the guy, saying, "Oh darling, would you be a dear please and pick that up for me?" He thought about it for a moment, and then turned his back for a second to retrieve the fallen article. The moment that he had reached the lipstick, my aunt was already running at full speed with her bag towards her house. She didn't dare look back, but she also didn't dare to make her way home. When she found a street corner, she turned, stopped immediately, and needed to see where the creep was. She was about to peek her eye around the corner, but that's when she realized she didn't need to. She could hear the man furiously running as fast as he could behind her, and she decided to carry it on and kept up the chase. She ran around that street and made a perfect square and looked around again, and he was just a little off. She was running out of energy and completely terrified, and saw some bushes in a neighbor's garden. She lunged into the bushes and tried as best she could to remain completely silent. There she remained, holding her hands over her mouth, eyes wide in the dark, seeing if this creep would pass her. She heard him before she saw him. He was running like there was no stopping him, fortunately completely oblivious to her hiding spot, and ran straight past. Fortunately for her, he kept on going and didn't seem to stop running even though he didn't see her. It took her about 20 minutes before she finally had the courage to even peep out of the bushes. She didn't hear anyone, and she didn't see anything, and she started walking back quietly, always looking behind her in case she'd need to burst into a sprint once more. She finally reached the stairs of the house and ascended them quickly. She looked around, and she said that it was at this moment that all her fears returned and that her heart dropped to her stomach. Out in the distance was the guy. He was watching, and he began running and running faster than before towards the house. As cliche as this may sound, my aunt then dropped the keys and was fumbling in her hands, shaking as she inserted them into the locks and finally ran into the door. It took the guy about 10 more seconds before he started banging on the door. My aunt just stood at the other side of the door, trembling. She didn't know what to do. She was scared that the guy would go fetch his crowbar and make quick work of the door as well. When she finally gained her composure, with the guy still banging on the door, did she run to the phone and dial 911 and explained that a creep was banging on the door, and she was pretty sure she saw him trying to break into a car earlier. The operator insisted on staying on the line and said that the police would be there soon to deal with this guy. She wasn't too far from the police station, and it only took about 3 minutes before she heard the whirl of sirens and the police approached the area. That's when the banging stopped and the guy started running. It didn't take long for the police to catch him too, and my aunt kept in touch with them to be informed of the proceedings. As it turns out, this guy had just been released from prison not 2 weeks before. And what do you know? In that time, he'd already been linked to a robbery in the area, was trying to break into a motor vehicle, and was creeping on my aunt. She was always dropped off home after bowling, or taken back home by her husband. It's always sat with me, this story, because I, as a petite young woman, fear for my safety after dark, and hope to never encounter anyone like this. This was back in October of 2018, when I had accompanied my mum to a clinic in a small town about an hour away from Frankfurt. I'm in my late 20s and female. We were there for about 2 weeks, while my mum underwent treatment for cancer. Unfortunately, soon after arriving, she experienced a lot of pain in her leg, and we later found out that the cancer had spread there, and her leg could break at any wrong step. This meant if we were going to see anything, I had to go alone. This was fine, as the town we were in was extremely small and filled mostly with the old and sick. There was a larger town only a few miles away, and over a fairly steep hill, and a large park in between. It was about noon, and my mum wasn't going to need me to be around. So I decided to go for a walk around the park. To get there, I just had to walk down the path, cross a street lined with inns and cafes on the side leading to the park. There are twisting paths, cross bridges over each other, a lot of benches, a couple fountains, and one or two community buildings. I chose a path that would take me right beside an underground fountain, about as deep as my shoulder, with steps leading down to the spout. It was there I first saw him. I was heading almost directly towards the fountain when a man's head pops up, looking directly at me. I looked back at him for a second, thinking I had surprised him just as much, and we do the normal look away quickly thing. I was the only one who looked away. When I looked back, I realized he was still watching me. Then I noticed he had one arm crossed over his chest and moving, as though he were touching himself. As soon as I realized this, I looked away and changed my direction in order to give him a wider berth. I was stunned and in disbelief that I convinced myself that whatever he was doing had nothing to do with me, and that as long as I kept walking, he would go back to being weird all by himself. I turned down a path that, for the immediate area, was wide open. I was still close to the cafes and inns, and the occasional other person also taking a midday walk. I was almost to an area that would take the path through patches of woods, which would also take me out of the public eye, when I looked back to see if the guy was still in the fountain, but he was gone. Surprised, I quickly did a circle and noticed he'd taken off, doing a wide loop that left a lot of opportunity for our paths to cross again if I didn't change direction. Once again, I couldn't believe it. I thought, it's the middle of the day. We're in a quiet but not unpopulated town about a mile away from a larger one. There's no one here but old and sick people. There's no way a predator would be here now and hunting me. But I still stopped and decided to change directions again. This time, my dumbass decided to take a tiny path that would lead me to the base of the hill that would go over the larger town and was heavily wooded. I get up to where the trees started and decide to look again. That's when I noticed that he'd also changed his direction and was practically jogging away from me. I looked back up the path and realized that continuing would leave me completely alone and vulnerable, and even though I didn't know where it led, I had a fairly good idea that the path the guy was jogging up would eventually connect to this path in the woods, because they all did. So I stood at the end of the path and waited until the guy was out of sight, before I turned around and headed in the opposite direction, through the grass of a pretty wide open portion of the park. I got to where I was a safe distance away and pulled out my phone to start recording myself. I figured I would just make it look like I was video chatting with someone. This was when I was shown without a doubt that this guy was after me, because not long after I made it across the park, but to where I could still see the path up the hill, he comes down the very same path looking side to side, looking for me. He eventually spots me again, as I had very bright dyed red hair and was pretty easy to spot in such a wide open area. It's at this point I feel safe enough because there are people nearby, and I'm within running distance from the town should this guy look towards me. I keep wandering around, testing to see how far this guy will go. He keeps following me, trying to stay out of sight, because at one point I quickly turn around, suddenly, to watch him sprint back into the trees, until eventually I go up a hill that has zero cover for him to use, and I lose track of him. I continued on to explore a different small town, making sure that I was always in a public space and easily seen, but I never saw him again. Trust your gut. My head was telling me there was no way this could be happening to me, and I almost tested it by walking up in the woods, but my gut screamed bad idea, and I couldn't be more relieved that I listened. Trust your gut. Around 2012, I lived in the industrial part of a city, where there weren't many houses around nearby. Just warehouses, trains, and some businesses scattered around. Even during the day it was rare to see people walking around, unless it was to or from the bus stop. One night, I was feeling off, like maybe my boyfriend and I had been arguing, or my roommates were getting on my nerves, and I decided that I needed to go for a walk. It was cold and late, past midnight. I just really needed some fresh air and time alone. I was a 21-year-old girl, who at that point in life wasn't very concerned about my own safety or well-being. I wouldn't say that I thought I was invincible, but I definitely did some careless and stupid stuff, and I'm lucky to have survived. This would qualify as one of those situations. I threw on my long trench coat, combat boots, a big fuzzy hat, and took off in a rush. There wasn't anything particularly scenic or pleasant around there, so I just went into the direction I knew best, towards the liquor store about half a mile away. As I approached the store, I reached into my pocket and realized that I had forgotten my wallet and phone. This store was closed anyway, so I just kept walking, still in the light of the neon liquor signs. I heard a car approach me and press on the brakes. I slowly looked over my shoulder to see the tip of my boyfriend's 90s silver Buick LeSabre moving alongside me. Relieved, I look to the driver's seat and see a man who is definitely not my boyfriend. He rolls down the window and says, "Get in the car." I was completely caught off guard, shocked, confused, and honestly kind of angry. "What?" "No," was my response, as I kept walking. He kept pace with me as I continued down the block. I kept looking over and finally told him to piss off, but he didn't do anything. He just kept right beside me, staring at me with the window down. Suddenly, he sped off, and a wave of relief washed over me. I really didn't know what to do next, so I cut around a corner and started walking in the opposite direction of the street back towards my house, towards the oncoming lane in case he came back around, which he did. He would stop and then creep forward as I walked, all the while mumbling things to me. He definitely seemed to believe that I was going to get into the car with him, because he surely was not taking no for an answer. This time at least, there was a whole lane between us, but I really had nowhere to go. If I decided to take off running towards my house, there was only one way to get there, through the deserted industrial area, following on down the road, which led into a tunnel under the train tracks. He would be able to follow me right to my front door, with no witnesses, very easily. There was a 24-hour convenience store a mile in the other direction, but was that really my best option? I felt helpless. Out of nowhere, I heard the chattering sound of people in an unmarked building beside me. Without a second thought, I frantically pushed the door and entered a scene that I will never forget. A bunch of sweaty men smiling and speaking to each other in Italian, as they cheered and finished their beers as they packed up their ping-pong paddles. They all stopped and looked at me, and I shakily exclaimed, "There's a man outside following me and I was really scared." It was silent for a second, as they all eyed one another suspiciously. But then one guy eventually offered me a ride home. I was so thankful to be in this stranger's fancy car for a whole minute and a half. I kept apologizing and thanking him. He was just kind of like, it's okay, be safe, sketchy looking girl who just busted into our weekly tournament, you weirdo, please don't rob me. When I got home, I immediately looked up the non-emergency police line, but decided against calling, because like I said, the dude was in the exact same make, model and colour as my boyfriend's car, who was likely to be in the same exact area shortly. Looking back, I probably should have made the call. When said boyfriend did get home, he was furious with me that I put myself in that situation. Like, sure, that was a dumb move by me, but what about this guy who was lazily trying to kidnap me? Who the hell does that? So, scary man in the silver Buick, please, let's not meet. I hope no girls met him that night, or ever. And Italian dudes, thank you so much for having your hobby right next to where and when I needed you the most. So, this is a story of something that happened to me and some friends when I was in high school. I have never shared this before. Since I've been thoroughly enjoying all the stories I've heard so far, I thought this would be the perfect place. I think I was in 10th grade. Me and 3 friends were smoking behind school. The school was about a 45-minute walk away from the neighbourhood where we all lived. It was a small high school town in Ontario, and it contained 2 large high schools and a bunch of medium-sized elementary/middle schools. It's common knowledge that with every small town when you're young, the main problem is that there's nothing to do within it except party and run around the streets acting like idiots. And that's what we did most of the time. But I went through phases when I was 13 to 15 where I just went to parks and school with friends and smoked or drank. This particular night was just a smoke. In the middle of our session, a car pulled around back of the middle of the school that we were smoking at. A man got out of the car and began walking towards us. It was dark enough and the car was far away enough that we couldn't make out faces. But as 14 to 15-year-old kids, we thought it was an adult coming to bust us for smoking. So naturally, we ran away through a field over a fence and up a small street with a few houses, and back onto the main road that would lead us home. This was the main road that ran into the middle of the entire town. As we were walking down the main road on the sidewalk, we passed by a convenience store on the right-hand side. This was at one point the only convenience store in town that sold cheap candy. Cheap, assorted, 5 cents per piece candy. We used to always come to this store as younger kids to buy it, so we were all very familiar with this part of town. So we treaded along with confidence, not even thinking twice about the person that we had just ran from. In our town, this was a normal occurrence. We were teenagers, loitering, and someone was coming to tell us to go away. So we did. End of story? No. Just as we were walking by Daisy Mart, headlights from that car lit up and blinked at us from an alleyway in between a concrete wall and the convenience store. The ignition started, and the car sped up towards us with considerable speed, so we ran out of the way. We looked back and realized it was the same car from the school. The car pulled out of the convenience store alley, but it turned the opposite direction of which we were walking. We thought it was just a creepy coincidence, but about 10 minutes later, the same car drove past us, and from tinted windows we heard someone in the car say, "We're still coming for you," and it drove off past us, up the road and out of sight. We were a little freaked out at this point, so we hurried along. The main road we were on eventually turned into a pretty sizable bridge, which loomed over a small river and pretty large forested area. On occasion, in the local news, you'd hear about children getting lost in the forested area, so it wasn't small by any means. So we all agreed to head under the bridge and take refuge to throw the guys who were trying to follow us off our tail. So we hung out under the bridge, probably for about 30 minutes, talking, smoking, and mildly shaken up, but pretty much laughing it off. This was creepy to us, but nothing to be alarmed about. As mentioned, we were kids in a small town. We were used to getting up to no good and having to run from the authorities. This was just another day. Our confidence was overinflated, and we never got caught. We lived in an area with so many small connecting streets and parks. Running and hiding after creating mischief was something that came second nature. We confidently headed back up the bridge to continue our walk home after the mentioned time. Now I'll explain this bridge. It was a long bridge, 4 lanes, 2 going in either direction. No room for a car to stop and wait. No designated parking lanes. It was somewhat of a mini highway. The bridge is also steep, so the middle of the bridge, which was also the area with the footpath that led to the forest, was the lowest point. There was absolutely no way any car could park anywhere on or near this bridge to idle and wait for us to come up from under the bridge. Not to mention that the car was nowhere in plain sight, and we decided to go under it in the first place. But after 2 minutes of walking, the car came up from behind us, and a man from inside the car said to us, "You thought you could get away from us? We'll always find you." So the car took off once again, but we decided to as well. Once we crossed the bridge, it led us back to our neighborhood. To stress the point again, the neighborhood we lived in contained many connected streets and many sections of homes and parks, a pretty large suburban area. If you didn't know where you were going, you could probably get lost pretty easily. So we ran to the closest, biggest park where no cars would be able to get into. One street was visible from the park, but since it was the middle of the night, if you were driving by the park, it would be hard to make out anyone in the park. So that's probably why we never saw the same car that had been following us drive by the park. It didn't stop this time. So since the park was literally in the middle of the neighborhood, we wished each other good luck, and we all took off in different directions to our respective homes. We each only lived 2 minutes away at this point, and we all made it home safely. This was about a week and a bit ago. I was on the bus from a shopping mall in Australia to a bus stop to which I'd get some food from a supermarket, Coles, and then walk home from there. I was on the bus with my 2 friends, and we all sat on our own seats, one behind each other. My friends and I are 17. About 5 minutes into the bus ride, this athletic-looking man got on the bus. He was white, mid to late 20s, possibly early 30s, wearing a white and blue rimmed tank top, blue shorts and sneakers, and I think his hair was short and dark blonde. Anyway, people obviously got on the bus. Nothing wrong so far. So we're about halfway to my stop now. About 10 minutes after the man got on, my friend Sarah was napping and Tammy was reading for English, and I was listening to music. The athletic man looked back at us, pretty sure that he was looking at Tammy at first. My friends and I sat on the left side of the bus, with the man sitting on the right side, probably about 3 to 4 seats in front of us. So I assumed that he thought Tammy was cute. But then I thought, wait, what the hell? She's 17, looks 17, and the man is about 30. The man stopped looking at Tammy, and then a minute later he looked back at Tammy again, just staring at her for a minute. Tammy and Sarah didn't notice. I looked back at the man, who made eye contact with me, and then stopped looking at Tammy. At this point I was suspicious, but I didn't say anything. Then he stared back at Tammy for a third time, this time for even longer. I glared at him because, hey, staring is creepy, to which he made eye contact with me again, and then stopped looking. I texted Tammy and was like, hey, my bus stop is soon, maybe 10 to 15 minutes away. Just so you know, the creepy dude is staring at you. Be careful, in case he's still on the bus when I leave. Just so you're aware, I'm a guy, and Tammy and Sarah are both obviously girls. Tammy acknowledges my text and nodded at me and cringed. So anyway, Tammy went back to reading, and I was listening to music. The man turned around and started staring at me this time, not Tammy. His eyes, I saw, were directly looking at me. I tried to avoid eye contact as he turned back around. He kept turning back around and staring at me for a total of 7 times for about a minute each, excluding the times he stared at Tammy. Each time he stared at me, he kept pressing the bus stop button to indicate to the bus driver that it was your stop. And he'd look at me, and he looked like he was about to keep pressing it as he stared at me. I told Tammy again to be careful, as this dude was still staring. So as the dude was staring at me still, I realized the next stop was mine, so I pressed the button. The bus stopped, and I got up and was getting off the bus as athletic dude got off behind me. He went in the opposite direction, but I turned around to quickly see what he was doing, just in case. He was walking down the footpath as I crossed. He turned around and saw me crossing, and consequently quickly crossed the road, paralleling me. I took note and went to Coles to get some Pepsi Max. I walked into Coles and realized that the man from the bus stop was also going into Coles, but he was literally matching my footsteps, speed, and movement. Every time I moved my left foot, he would too. He was staring at me as I walked in, and I sped walked into the aisle to get my Pepsi Max and looked around to see if he was there. I couldn't see him. I walked into the self-service counter and was paying for my Pepsi Max. As he walked past, self-served slowly while staring at me, giving me the most evil glare I have ever seen. I quickly walked out and tried to see if he was following me. He was. He was speed walking to catch up with me and didn't even buy anything. Needless to say, I ran home as fast as I could for 10 minutes straight. He was no longer behind me, and I lost him. I have no idea where he went, and I haven't seen him since. Back when I was 14/15, I hung around with a sizable group of friends. We would meet up in what we called the field, basically a large park in the middle of a residential area which backed onto a cemetery. On one side was an imposing hotel with large grounds, and on the other, fenced-in wastelands. We hung around towards the back of the field, which was surrounded by trees and bushes, so visibility was nil from the street. Added to that, it was very poorly lit, so we would build bonfires at night to provide light and warmth in winter. During the day, large gangs of us would come and go. We'd head to the shops or play curbs on the street. A local weirdo would often walk by, looking back over his shoulders at us every few seconds, immediately averting his gaze if eye contact was made. He would shuffle around the corner only to reappear at regular intervals. He was an absolute creep, and this was displayed in his physicality. He was short and of slim build, balding with tufts of long hair creeping down the nape of his neck. As previously described, he would walk in a shuffling motion, stopping abruptly and turning around to watch us. His eyes darted all over the place, and he never made direct eye contact. Being teenagers, and with the bravado of safety in numbers, we never really viewed him as a threat. The lads would roar at him, call him a perv, and tell him to piss off. We gave him little thought. One night around November/December, I'd arranged to meet friends in the field after dinner. Around this time of year in Ireland, it's pitch black by 4, and it was 6:15, and I was 15 minutes early. The field was dark and empty, but with the fearlessness and naivety of youth, I strolled to our usual spot at the back of the park to wait. Keep in mind, this was around 95 or 6, pre-everyone having mobile phones. We had customized our little hut into one of these bushes, complete with branches that we used as seats. I seated on one of them and lit a smoke. All was silent for several minutes, until I heard a slight rustling in one of the bushes. I was slightly concerned, but figured it was a squirrel. The rustling stopped for several moments, but picked up again louder and more vigorous. Definitely not the work of a squirrel. Alarmed, I shot up from my seated position and tried to make out the source of the noise in the dim visibility. Out of nowhere he emerged from the bush. Pounced would be more accurate, and he was mere feet away from me. He stared directly at me, with the most menacing grin I have ever witnessed to this day, and he put his finger up to his lips in a shushing gesture. I bolted, through the bushes, branches whipping at my face, and I stumbled at one point, catching myself before I fell. I ran out of that goddamn park into what felt like slow motion at the time, straight to my house about half a kilometer away. I don't know if he followed me. I didn't look back. I didn't see him again. As I later learned, he spent several years in a mental facility. The next time I heard of him, he had murdered his father, beating and eventually stabbing him to death. He was convicted of the murder and detained in a mental facility. I thought little about him in the 20 or so years since the incident, until a few months back, that he was on my bus gazing around creepily. He looked my way, but there was no recognition on his part. I really hope to not encounter him again. I was 16, coming home from a friend's house. While I was getting on the train, this man was following me. He was perhaps 45 to 50, and didn't speak English all that well, but well enough that I could understand him. So I was getting on the bus, and like a lot of people, there's nothing to make him stand out. Well, I go to sit down, and he sits right down next to me, which was unsettling, because there were other open seats, but I'm not new to creepy people in public places, so I just stayed there. I was by myself, and it was about 6 p.m. at this time in the winter, and I live in Midwestern USA, and so it was already dark out. Then this man starts talking to me, and I was in the corner seat, so I couldn't move unless he got out of his seat, or I just went over to him. He starts off talking to me about where I'm going, and I say that I'm going to meet some friends, as I didn't want him to think that I was going home and follow me. I thought it was strange for him to ask me where I was going, and I was already paranoid as heck. Then he asks me for a hug. I say no, and then he goes on to tell me he needs a hug because his wife just died and he's sad. I started ignoring him at this point, and he goes on to say that his daughter also just died. He starts making up stuff, and I'm ignoring him. After about 20 minutes I get off the train, and I'm super thankful to get away from this strange man. That's not the end though. The man got off at the exact same stop. At this point I was waiting for the bus to come to bring me to my final destination, and the man gets off and follows me to the bus stop. Waiting for the bus with perhaps 2 other people and this man, he doesn't approach me. But as the bus pulls up, he comes and puts his arms around me and tells the other people that this is his girlfriend, referring to me. No one really said anything, and we got into the bus, and I started getting super nervous and grabbed my phone from my bag, in case I needed to call 911 or something, if this man kept following me. He again sits by me, but I don't sit where I'm trapped in this time. He starts saying he can walk me to my friends so that I can get there safely, and I respectfully decline. Then he says, I'm going to take you to your friends, so that he was verified that he was indeed going to follow me. Which sucks, because I wasn't actually meeting friends, I was going to my house. I start panicking, and want to call my mum to pick me up from the bus stop instead of walking there, and to my luck, my phone is dead. It's dark, I'm alone, my phone's dead, and some weird-ass dude is trying to follow me. He continues to talk to me, but I don't even know what it's about. And the bus was empty at this point besides just us and the driver, and one other guy. And bless the other guy's soul. I kept looking over at the other guy very intensely, and the panic really started setting up, and I was not answering any conversations with the weirdo anymore. The other man comes up and tells the weirdo to leave me alone, or he's going to call the cops, and that I clearly don't want to talk. At this point, the weirdo gets very aggressive, and is telling him to fight him, and cussing him out and all this stuff. Then, the next stop comes, and the other man physically removes this weirdo from the bus. I was so happy. I thanked the man so much, and luckily, it ended well. It was still very uncomfortable, and seeing how aggressive this guy got, I doubt his intentions were good. This happened a few summers ago, when I was living in Montreal. I lived in Mile End and worked in Plateau, 2 adjacent neighborhoods that were usually full of tourists, students, and people just hanging out. I walked to and from work through a series of pretty tree-lined alleyways that were peaceful and quiet and full of cats. Anyone familiar with this area will know the kind of alleyways I am talking about. I always felt safe, because there were so many people hanging out on their back balconies, overlooking the alleys in the summertime. Occasionally, I ran into people strolling with their dogs, or kids messing around, or drunk dudes would catcall from their balconies. But typically, my walk to and from work were uneventful. That is, until this day. I left work at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and began my walk home. After I crossed Mont Royal, a main street, I could pretty much take one long alleyway all the way home. So that's what I did. I didn't use headphones or anything. I was just walking and daydreaming and taking in the beautiful summer afternoon. I didn't sense that a single thing was off, and I walked for about 5 to 10 minutes before I heard someone yelling from their balcony up ahead. My French is pretty bad, and they were far up, so I didn't catch any specifics. I ignored it and kept walking, and 2 minutes later, this big guy comes bursting out of his back gate into the alley, talking hurriedly to me in French. When he realized that I'm Anglo, he switches to English and says quietly, "There's someone following you. He came into the alley behind you and has been ducking behind garages and garbage cans. We could see him from our porch." He points up to where his companion is still sitting, a few stories up on a small balcony, with a pretty good view of down the alleyway. I was hesitant and said that it must just be someone walking their dog or something, and that I hadn't seen or noticed anyone behind me. I really didn't know how to make any sense of the situation, but I thought he must be mistaken. The man shakes his head and yells down the alleyway, "Get the hell out of here," or something to that effect. But nothing interesting happens. Nobody appears. So he starts striding down the way I came, when all of a sudden a man stands up from where he was hiding, ducked behind the wall of someone's garage. He was skinny, had long brown scraggly hair, and a leather jacket on, even though it was about 30 Celsius outside. I made eye contact with him for a split second, before he took off running back down the alleyway, and he had these wild, angry eyes that still give me chills. The balcony Samaritan booked it after him, but the guy was gone just like that. We weren't sure what to do, or what we even could say to the police. So balcony Samaritan walked me onto Park Avenue, which is close to a main road, and I thanked him profusely for saving me from whatever the alley stalker had planned for me that afternoon. It still scares the crap out of me that I didn't sense a single thing was off, and didn't have a feeling of being watched. Nothing. I'm 31 now, but was a teen when I was walking home one sunny day. It was winter, but winter in Florida is just a nice cool breeze. I remember holding a Tupperware in my hand that is still hot, containing pasta and broccoli that my grandma had just made. It was so cool living 1 block away from my grandma, because a quick 10-minute walk meant I got some really good leftovers. In between my house and her house was a patch of woods, but thorns and thickets prevented me from taking a shortcut through them. I remember looking down at the sidewalk just as I reached the middle of the patch of woods to my right. I heard someone ask, "Hey, where are you going?" I looked up, and to my left towards the road, a thin man in a white van with his window rolled down smiled at me. He was driving in the opposite direction of the way I was walking. I simply said, "Home," and continued to walk. He started to say, "Hey, hey," so I looked back to see him hanging out of his driver window. "I'll give you a ride home. Come here," he says. I kept walking and loudly say, "No thanks." I stopped and turned around when I heard him drive away. I began walking again, creeped out, wishing that the woods didn't run long next to the sidewalk. I remember wishing I were home already. I was super alert, now hearing every critter in the brush to my right, the rustling leaves and stuff scurrying about. I pick up the pace, reminding myself that those woods were packed with lizards. I said to myself out loud, "It's just lizards running around, silly." But when I hear a vehicle coming up behind me, out of fear I look back, and to my horror, it's the same white van with the man smiling. The van slows down next to me, and a big, angry-looking man flung open the side door and jumped out. I turned to my right and began running as fast as I could into the woods. I was jumping over bushes and long vines, clenching my grandma's Tupperware for dear life. I looked back once, and the thick brush of the woods was slowing down the big man. I knew just going straight, I would reach my backyard, guarded by a chain-link fence. I remember the thorns and sticks slicing my skin, but I couldn't feel the pain. I just kept thinking, run. Once I reached the fence, I chucked the Tupperware and hoisted myself over, ripping my jeans and face-planted the ground on the other side with a loud thud. I ran onto my porch and began banging the back door. My dad let me in, and I'm literally panicking, covered in dirt and cuts, trying to lock the back door. I felt safe to be back home with my dad and our Rottweilers. He sat me down and started questioning me, and immediately called the cops. The 2 cops arrived and took a report, and they said, nothing like that's ever happened in my area before, and one of them even told me that lying was against the law. I remember they left, and my dad swore he believed me, and I could sleep in his room that night if I wanted. I remember feeling really sad and frustrated about not being believed and going to his bed without even eating the pasta with broccoli. It was hard to sleep or go anywhere for months after that, because I was scared the men were still out there. My dad ended getting me a cell phone and installing an alarm system to help me feel safe. I still have issues being alone to this day. To the men that tried to get me, let's never meet again. So I've been living in Paris for the last 8 months, and have felt relatively comfortable with my surroundings. I was coming home from a club on the first train that goes to my town. This is around 5:30 a.m. Note, I was quite drunk and tired and just wanted to sleep, and I was wearing clothes for going out. There was this guy on the platform who tried to talk to me. I walk over, trying to reach the next train car over, but failed. There were 2 open seats left, so I sit in one of them, and he decides to sit in the one across from me. So he starts telling me, I really want to marry you. I don't even want to do you or anything. I just want to be your one and only. Please, will you do the pleasure of becoming my wife? As he's saying this, he is caressing my thigh. I am genuinely uncomfortable and try to sink down into my chair. I'm just like, no, I'm not interested. I have a boyfriend, which is the truth. So he resorts to saying, if you had one, he would be here with you taking you home. Now, my boyfriend lives 5 hours away, close to the border between France, Germany, and Switzerland, so he could not be there. I explained to him, and he says that he's not a good boyfriend to leave me here. He then says that he's a nice guy, and has money, and can take care of me. I told him I wasn't interested. Then I get to my stop, and he follows me out. After he begs for me to go back to his place, he continues talking to me, and I start shivering because I didn't bring a jacket. He sees this, and forcibly puts his jacket on me. He says that I'm not feeling well, and that he'll walk me home, although I beg him not to. He tries to talk to other people to get him on his side. We reach this one lady who saw my discomfort on the train. We explain both of our sides to her for about 2 hours. I kid you not. She finally says, since you're not her boyfriend, you can't walk her home. I will. I was so thankful to her. We left, and she had to take her bus to work. I thought I was safe, but sadly no. So I start walking to my apartment. I live about 10 minutes away from the station, and I was about halfway there when I heard a whistle. I turned back, and lo and behold, it's the creep. He runs up to me and continues to say the same crap and begs for my number. He does all of this while he's caressing my face. I slap his hand and tell him if he doesn't stop, I'll hurt him. He continues, so I threaten to call the police. Only then does he scamper off. I got home at around 8:39 and cried my eyes out. Creepy sudden marriage proposal, dude? Please, let's not meet again. This happened 4 years ago. I lived in Staten Island for a few years because I went to college there. I was about 20 years old at the time. One evening, I went to a Need for Speed screening in Manhattan, unfortunately alone because my friend bailed on me at the last minute. I love Aaron Paul and Kid Cudi, and I just had to go see it, even if it was by myself. As some of you may know, Staten Island is part of New York City, but still very far from everything, which resulted to be the longest and scariest trip of my life. When I transferred to 2-to-1 train at Chambers Street, and while waiting for one train, this weird guy approached me and asked for my name. I think his name was Chris. I lied to him and told him my name was Sophia, and kept walking away from him. He then offered me candy, which I declined. This was around 9:30 p.m. or so, and welcome to NYC. The train was taking forever. This freaked me out even more. He would ask me questions like where I'm from, which school I go to, and I lied about every single thing I said. He told me that he lived in Brooklyn, and I noticed another woman by us who kept turning around to see my situation. I decided to sit next to her and whispered to her and asked her to pretend she knew me. She told me how she was going to approach me anyway because she knew I could be in a dangerous situation. So the train comes and I decide to miss it. However, this guy Chris tapped on my shoulder and said, "Sophia, the train is here." At this moment, I got the worst goosebumps and I was sweating so much. I told him, "Thank you, but this is my friend and we're going to talk." I thanked the woman who helped me and hopped onto the next train. When I got to the ferry station, I did not feel safe or comfortable. So I, for some reason, went up to this sweet-looking couple and explained my situation, and they kindly offered that I can sit next to them on the ferry. Fortunately, they were travelling on the same bus after the ferry too. Now you'd think the story would end here, but nay. Remember how this guy Chris said that he lived in Brooklyn? As soon as I sit with the couple, I see the guy walking back and forth by us. I informed the couple that this was the guy who was creeping on me, and I almost started crying. The couple comforted me, and the guy told me that he knows martial arts, which helped calm me down a little bit. However, this Chris guy would not stop walking by us the whole time the ferry was moving, which was about 20 to 25 minutes, although it felt as if it were 300 hours that night. The creepiest part of this situation is that when I thought we lost him while getting off the ferry, Chris walked right by me and said, "I hope to see you again, Sophia." I wanted to legit disappear off the earth at that moment, and the couple told him off and threatened to call the police on him if he didn't stay away from me. Thankfully, the couple and I got on the bus together, and they gave me their numbers to let them know that I am back in my dormitory safe, since their stop was before mine when I got to campus. I asked the security guy to drive me back to my dorm so I was home safely. I really hope to not meet him again. You gave me one of the biggest anxieties in the world. I always used to walk 4 blocks to school and back. Simple. Sometimes I liked to stop by my local park, which would be the 2nd block, and swing for a bit before carrying on. It was easy, didn't bother anyone, nor did it bother me, at first. Cut to a few months ago. I was walking down the first block, and two grown men stopped me at the bus stop that they were waiting on. One smiled creepily at me and reached out, wanting me to fist bump them. I did so to be polite. The other merely asked if I spoke Spanish, to which I said no. But then the first man got up, and it appeared that he was going to advance towards me. I immediately panicked and went into fight or flight mode. He didn't do anything, just walked past me. I relaxed and continued on my way to school. It wasn't until the man who fist bumped me, Mark, started catcalling me in Spanish. I didn't know what exactly he was saying, but I knew he was making remarks about my butt. Not to mention Mark looked about 50 to 60 years old, and he was making inappropriate remarks about an underage minor of 17. I arrived at school safely and informed my teacher quickly about it. I haven't encountered him since, until a few days ago. I was at the park again and decided to head home early. It was Halloween, so I knew the weirdos would be out and about soon. My city isn't the safest, and it's the second place of having the highest crime rate. I was waiting for the stoplight to go green so that I could cross to the first block, which would be where I lived, of course. Then my heart sunk when I realized who was roaming across from me. Mark. At first I wasn't completely sure if the two incidents were months apart, but I could easily recognize his face, and I knew he remembered mine too. I had no choice but to cross if I wanted to get home, as it would be the quickest way possible. My anxiety flared up when I saw him grin widely at me and let out a maniacal laugh. He tried pinning me against the hedge, which would honestly be super pointless as I could jump over and get away if I needed to. My fight or flight kicked in when he tried reaching for my shoulder, and I ducked and ran quickly home, immediately informing my mother about it. I haven't been to school for a week due to it, and because my mum refuses to let me walk alone anymore. What makes this incident even more scary is that there have been increasing reports of human trafficking, which makes me fear what could have happened if I hadn't have gotten away. So Mark, if you do read this, let's never meet again. When I was about 24 or so, I worked at a hotel about a half-mile from my house. My husband and I were dirt poor at the time, so I walked to and from work. I lived in a small town in Louisiana, so things were seemingly safe typically. I had just gotten off shift at 3 p.m. and started my journey home. I had a backpack with my laptop in it slung over my shoulder. I get about halfway home, and this man comes walking up one side of the road. He looks to be about 35 or so, tall and medium build. I keep walking, but I notice he's staring at me. He begins to yell, "Hey girl," and continues to walk in my direction. At this point I'm on high alert and quicken my pace. He is coming from one of the side roads in front of me, so at this point he is standing in the way of me and my house. He begins towards me and yells again. I nod at him. He asks, "Where are you going in such a hurry, girl?" I tell him I'm going home to my husband, which is right around the corner, without giving him the actual location. He reaches out towards me and says, "Why don't you come over to my house and we can talk? Take a break from all that walking." I tell him no, and attempt to walk by him. At this point he reaches out and grabs my arm. "I told you to come back to my house and we can chat." At this point I'm in tears, yelling at him no and to not touch me. Cars are passing by and people are looking but not stopping. I jerk away from him, slam him in the face with my laptop bag, and that stunned him long enough for me to just run away. Along the way he was yelling at me, saying I was an ungrateful so-and-so and he just wanted to chat. I got home and broke down and lost myself. I passed by that guy's house so many times after that and always felt such an intense fear. This took place 7 years ago. I was 21 and usually more street savvy than this, but was coming off the back of a bad relationship and was going through somewhat of a messy phase. This particular night, I'd made 2 errors. The first was I'd gone out with people I'd class as acquaintances rather than friends, and the second was that I had too much to drink. This meant that the people I was with just left, long before I did. Having had way more to drink than I usually would have, I can't really remember how I ended up alone at the end of the night. All I remember is it being some time around 4 or 5 a.m. I was outside of the closed nightclub in the center of town, and it was cold and completely deserted. Not a single soul around. I was out of money and had left my bank card at home, so no way of getting a taxi. And even if I'd have had the money, there was not a single one in sight. I couldn't call for one, as the taxi place was shut by this time, so I was trying to call my friends to find out where they were, not paying as much attention to my surroundings as I should have. And seemingly out of nowhere, a man appeared. He startled me as he appeared from nowhere, and immediately struck up a conversation. Whilst he wasn't saying anything overtly threatening, the way he was so familiar with me seemed off. I was clearly drunk, alone, and pretty vulnerable, whereas he didn't seem remotely intoxicated, and was too comfortable. He was asking my name, and I was stumbling over my words. And when I didn't tell him, he said, "Here, why don't you add me on Facebook?" Took my phone out of my hands and added himself using my Facebook app, and then he had my name. I kept saying I had to go and that I needed to get home, but he wouldn't let me leave. I was pretty freaked out at this point and sizing up the situation. There was no one around that I could go to for help. He was well over 6 feet in comparison to my 5'2", and he'd easily catch and overpower me on a good day, so there was no chance of running now while I was drunk and wearing sky-high heels. But something told me to keep it calm and friendly. His friendliness seemed false, and like he would turn nasty at any given moment. He kept me talking for what seemed like forever, and I kept calm while still reiterating that I needed to get home. And then somehow I managed to just walk off. I can't remember the moments before. He may have been distracted by a phone call or just allowed me to go. All I can remember thinking as soon as I'd walked calmly around the corner and out of sight was run. So I did, as fast as I could, in spite of my stupid heels, which I kicked off halfway down the hill. I'd start crying at some point, and I was so focused on getting away, I didn't notice the 2 people until I ran straight into them. They immediately asked what the matter was, and I was clearly terrified, and one of them stayed with me while the other double-checked to make sure the creepy guy had really gone. Then they gave me a drink and a jacket as I was shivering and walked me the rest of the way home. I finally managed to get through to my friend who met me at my place, so I wasn't alone for the rest of the night. To this day I don't know what he may or may not have been planning. If it was something really bad, then he didn't really think it through enough, and I had his full name and details from when he added himself on Facebook with my phone, which I immediately removed and blocked when I got home. Maybe he was just hoping to get lucky, and gave up when he realized I wasn't interested. Either way, it was really intimidating, and I've never walked home alone since. This all happened about 4 years ago. I had been to a party, and it ended past midnight, and my mother was out of town, so she couldn't come and collect me. I was home alone. So I walked home with a female friend, and it wasn't a dangerous place, so we weren't afraid. We were talking and laughing, of course not very loudly, but we weren't drunk or anything. Then we turned a corner and saw a woman, mid-height, who was covering almost all her body except for her eyes. We didn't pay a lot of attention to her, because we didn't want to provoke her or anything. About 15 minutes pass, and I felt something odd. So we turned around, and I saw the same woman trying to hide in a wall. It didn't work out well for her because I could recognize her almost immediately. I messaged my friend about it, so the woman didn't notice I'd seen her. We started to panic a little, and we accelerated our pace. My friend and I were supposed to stay at my house for a sleepover, and after 20 minutes, when we arrived at my house, and as I was trying to open the door, my friend screamed really loudly, "There she is!" and she pushed me to get into the house. We were really, really, really afraid, so we dialed 911. I went to drink some water, and I heard someone who was trying to break into the house by the window at the kitchen. You couldn't have opened the window easily, but somehow she did. I told my friend to go to my room and contact the police from there. I grabbed a knife and hid behind the door of the kitchen. I saw her entering my house, and I wanted to throw up because I was really nervous and sweating. I had a shot of adrenaline and shouted as loudly as possible, "Get the hell out of my house," with a knife in hand. She screamed and went out the window. I thought she was on drugs or something. The police arrived in a few minutes, but couldn't do anything to identify the woman because she wore gloves. When my mum came home, we brought an alarm and everything. Please, please, always carry pepper spray, and dial 911 if you feel something's odd while walking on the street. Never underestimate a situation. Okay, so there are a few things which I would like to clarify before we get started. 1. I come from a place that has had, and still has to this day, some serious problems with violence towards women and kidnapping of young women, and is sadly something that happens very often. 2. Although I lived all my life in a decent area, some of the other areas weren't so decent, so I kind of learnt how to avoid problems. With this in mind, let's get into the story. So it's been a while since I moved to another country, where I had been feeling safe for the past 2 or 3 years, and my family decided that it was finally time to pay me a visit in my new home. The differences between environments were so great that they were all perplexed and amazed about doing things that would be otherwise considered normal to many, like going out at late hours of the night. During their stay, I suggested we should all go to the city centre, and we did. It was such a lovely thing. The weather was nice, we had dinner at a good restaurant, and took some pictures. But they began to get tired, so we started to make our way home. It wasn't even 11 p.m. yet, but it had been a long day of going around. I was talking to my parents as I led the group back, when I noticed a couple of men coming on the opposite direction, with cell phones up, like they were taking a video. I ignored it and kept moving, thinking that they were just tourists. I got my chills when I noticed that the guys are only 1 block away from when I first saw them, and they were standing just a few meters away from us. These guys had gone back on their steps somehow, and were now very near, and not 5 minutes after, I saw them. They were looking at me intently, and even followed me with their eyes. My first reaction was to ignore them, pretend that I didn't see them as to not alert my family, because it so happened to be that some of my family are quite dramatic, and would just blow things out of proportions. So I carried on, and these guys did too. Even trying to walk as closely as possible to be making eye contact with me. I begin to use my father to hide from their view, as he's tall, chubby, and always has the appearance of being a frightening person, but he's pretty chill unless provoked. For a time this worked, and the guys kept their distance, but when we arrived to the metro it got creepier still. One of the guys found his way to sneak around to be one person behind my dad on the electric stairs and tried to walk past him, even attempting to keep making eye contact. Then I noticed that his hands never left his face, covering his mouth for no reason. The other guy was far behind, but I managed to keep myself out of view, and luckily, whoever that was in front of the guy pushed him backwards. I don't know how, but we managed to lose them in between the crowd, but not before I'd get one last glance at them, saying something to each other and pointing to me with their fingers. I hope to never meet those creeps again. This happened about 3 years ago, but I honestly thought nothing of it, until a friend told me a similar story and got me quite upset about it. It got me thinking about my own experience, and I realized I may have escaped a dangerous situation out of pure luck and stubbornness. So way back 3 years ago, I had started working at a little food truck type business that sat outside a local Lowe's. I was in college, and the owner was really cool about working around my schedule and letting me do homework on my shift. My mum and I both had jobs, but only one car. Usually our schedules didn't cross too much, so only having one car wasn't that much of a problem. However, that day, our schedules crossed over in a really weird way. Well, my brother and sister-in-law live about 5 minutes down the road from where I work. They were out of town for the weekend, but told me I could stay the night at their place and walk to work the next day. That day was crazy hot, but I was pretty used to the heat because the little shop I worked in could get up to 100 degrees easily. Anyway, the road they lived on didn't have any sidewalks, so I had to just walk through people's front yards so that I wouldn't get hit by cars. I was about halfway to my destination when this fancy-ass white SUV pulled up close to me, and this older guy in his 40s rolled down his window and called out to me, "Hey there, you need a ride?" Having not really been paying attention, I automatically said, "No thank you." I don't know why, but that's always my automatic reaction to when someone catches me off guard with a question. "Are you sure? It's really hot out here, and a young girl like you shouldn't be walking on dangerous roads like this." Somewhere in the back of my mind, an alarm started going off. But I like to think the best of people, so I didn't pay it much attention. "No, it's okay," I said. "I'm just going to the Walmart." The Walmart was actually on the opposite side of the shopping area from my work. I don't know why I lied, but for some reason, I didn't want to tell him where I was actually going. I figured that it would be the end of it, and just continued walking. "It's not a problem," he insisted, keeping pace with me in his car. "Just hop in. It's not out of my way." "No, really, I'm good. I like walking." At this point, the guy started to get frustrated. He scowled at me and said something like, "I'm just trying to be a nice guy." And that's when he noticed more cars behind him and must have realized he was holding up traffic, because he gave me one final scowl, growled, "Whatever," and zoomed off. Now, I don't like to be a suspicious person, but whether this guy was a legitimately harmless person or had something more sinister in mind, I don't know. But nonetheless, pushy guy in the fancy SUV, let's not meet again. I had been eyeing up these snow boots from Target for a few weeks, and finally had enough to buy them. I got them, and then went over to my friend's house with them to show her. She lives directly across the street from me, so it's maybe a 30-second walk door to door. I hung out over there for a while, and then at around 10:30 decided to go home, since I had to take the bus to class very early next morning. It was trash night, so I went inside, grabbed a full bag and went out to the garage door and took it out to the curb. I heard some crunching in the leaves in my yard, but it was dark, and I just figured it was an animal. I went back in for the recycling bin, and when I put it at the curb, a man approached me. He asked for directions to a nearby street, so I told him. He then leaned in and whispered in my ear, "I'm going to do things to you." It was very clear he had sexual assault on his mind. I took off running towards the house, tripped on my snow boots, and fell into the garage. He was behind me, but I got inside and locked the interior garage door before he got to me. I heard him messing around in the garage. I ran upstairs and told my mum what happened. We called 911, and I spoke to the dispatcher, while my mum found something that could be used as a weapon and went to see if he was still in there. He wasn't, so she closed the garage door and we waited for the police. The officers drove around looking for him for a bit. Then they came to my house to talk to me. They didn't find him. About a week later, I was on the bus and saw him. He looked right at me, but the way he acted was like he didn't recognize me. I called my friend to come and meet me at the bus stop by the house, and we walked back to her house and called the police again. They came out, but still didn't find him. Probably one of the scariest times of my life. Oh, and I ended up throwing the snow boots away. I just couldn't wear them after that. I was 14 years old at the time. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in a bus coming home, as I spent the morning running with friends in the park. So I was on the bus, listening to music, and looking outside through the window, when I just checked the inside of the bus to see how many stops I had left. As I scanned the bus, I eye contact with a guy who's about 23 to 25. I immediately looked at the window again, and I just felt him staring at me. Every time I checked, he was looking at me. I was very uncomfortable, and it was like that for 30 minutes. The bus finally arrived at my stop, and prayed with all my heart that he didn't go down now. At the bus stop, I saw him get up about 20 seconds after me, so I started walking faster. But he followed me and started talking to me. "Hi, how are you? You're beautiful." I began to walk faster. "How old are you? You're pretty." I whisper, 14. He tried to talk to me. We walked by a group of people who stopped to talk about whatever they promote or defend. A woman came to talk to me and started explaining her thing. The guy backed up a little, and after 30 seconds he tried to speak to me again, and I told him, "I'm already talking to someone." He backed up and waited. At this point the girl asked me if I knew the guy. I was shaking and said no, and that he had been following me since the bus. He called one of her colleagues, and her colleague, bless her, started screaming and shaming him for harassing a 14-year-old girl. As she yelled at him, I thanked the other girl and started running to my home. I ran for 20 minutes. I had tears, and when I finally arrived at my apartment and closed the door, I was shaking and crying. But I was very glad those girls were there, and that I was finally safe. Back in community college, I rode the bus to and from college. The bus stop was walking distance to my house, so it was a huge help for me. When I am on the bus, I always listen to music and look outside. Never at my phone, never at anyone else. I guess that's how I never noticed the man constantly looking at me. One day I went through to go to the computer, to memes and chat with my boyfriend through Facebook. The dude pulls up a chair next to me and sits down looking at my memes and says hi. He startled me immediately. Then he went on to say, "Hey beautiful, I thought I'd come by and say hi. I see you on the bus a lot and thought you might want some company, you know?" Me. My hair is messed up, my nose is congested, and I'm sleepy as hell. Who are you?" "I'm Jack, and I think you're pretty." I've got to go to class now." I leave, but not heading to class in case he followed me. He follows, and then turns around a bit and leaves. After college, the dude shows up at my bus stop at the exact same time my class ends and waits for me, and says the same stuff as last time. He repeats this for about a week, until I finally tell the bus driver. This dude is following me and it's creeping me out very much. Me and the bus driver are cool, you see. And the bus driver closes the door and drives off, leaving behind the creepy dude before he had any opportunity to get in. The creepy guy starts telling his classmates how he's going to get laid soon. The only reason why I know this is because one of his classmates is my best friend. I pointed out to him who my creepy stalker was, and my friend told me that he keeps talking about how he attempted to hook up with a chick and maybe will get laid soon. In your dreams, moron. I cussed him out next time he appeared at the end of my class. He said he was sorry, baby. I won't do it again. Dumbass, I'm not your baby. Now piss off or I'll call the police. I'm serious, I don't even know who you are. The cool teacher hears our conversation and has a discussion with him privately, and he leaves me alone forever. This happened last year. Where I used to work, me and my friend would always go to Denny's on Friday and get a milkshake to celebrate the beginning of the weekend. We leave work in separate cars, as we go our separate ways after our milkshakes. I pull in first to the parking lot, and my friend follows. We park on the side of the building, and there's a guy somewhere between the ages of 20 to 35. He was wearing a Chicago Bears beanie hat, and he was just standing there, seeming to be just loitering, just watching the cars go by, smoking a cigarette. I thought nothing of it, as maybe he was waiting for someone, or was just about to leave. Anyway, me and my friend go in and have our milkshakes. Fast forward 20 minutes, and we wrap up and leave. We both smoke a cigarette in the parking lot, and we go back into our own cars and leave. I get home 20 minutes later, because that's how far away I live from Denny's. I wake up about half hour later, so 1 a.m, and my dogs are barking like crazy while jumping up by the front window of my house, the window that faces the driveway. I look out the window, and the trunk of my car is open. So I go outside to further investigate what the hell is going on. There in the snow are footprints, and a red Chicago Bears beanie. My dash and fuse box panel under the steering wheel were all open, and some wires were cut. There was also a metal shim stuck in the ignition. I call the cops, and they fill out a report. They say that it looked like someone tried stealing my car by hot-wiring it. The random guy from Denny's managed to ride 20 minutes home with me in the back of my car, without me ever even knowing he was riding with me. And then he proceeded to try and steal my car. I'm not sure if they ever found the guy. It was at one of the more western sides of the Orange Line, maybe East Falls Church. One of the metro exits puts you right up into the parking lot, whereas they put a long guardrail and bushes to keep you from the very nearest corner of the parking lot. I had parked in that area, I think, and I'd been close to the metro station entrance. When I came back out of the station and had to walk out of the thick bush line, the corner of the lot looked pretty remote and barely lit. I decided to walk perpendicular to those bushes, deeper out into the lot, and then J-turn towards my car. I had spotted two guys hanging around in my travel line that I moved away from and walked on by. They forgot about me and moved towards my car in that dark corner. My car, in fact, a flashy black 300ZX. When I turned the curve position of the J, I saw them. They saw me, and they realized I had spotted them. So they milled around a second time to make an excuse to go back to the center of the lot. I hopped into my car and fired it up, and drove out. The next person to go into the back area, immediately as I was driving out of the lot, they robbed and killed. I got the sick shivers after that. I got back to Reston and heard that on the news. Note, they changed that section a lot and did away with the bushes at the exit after the event. I have a joking phrase I made up for my own daughter, or anyone else. You see what you saw. If someone looks strange or potentially dangerous, it is. Take immediate action to get away from it, like making a J-turn and observing. Every Friday, me and a group of friends would meet up at a friend's house basement to watch movies and just hang out. My house was a couple of houses down in a street that curved slightly, so from my friend's house you couldn't see my house, but it was within the same block. I was 16 at the time, and normally another friend who was making his way home would walk me back, but he didn't go this particular Friday. It was sometime around 9, and I decided to walk back home. Gave my mum a quick call before I left and mentioned I would be heading home soon. When I left my friend's house, there was a group of guys hanging out outside. I didn't think much of it, since it was normal for people to be hanging out around this time in the area. As I make my way down a couple of houses, I feel like I'm being watched, but don't think too much about it until I'm being surrounded by a bunch of guys who look to be 18 to 21. Truthfully, I didn't know what to do, so I just kept walking and trying to get home as they said things to me and started to get closer. At some point, I stopped scared as they closed in on me within sight of my house. I couldn't even scream of how terrified I felt when I heard a scream yelling for them to get away. Apparently my mum had got a feeling to look out the window, and I am so glad she did. She screamed for my dad to get out, and he did, getting between them and me. He just told me to run inside the house. The creeps ran away while grabbing a metal garbage can top and throwing it at us, landing in our car in our driveway. That dent always reminded me of how lucky I was. Some friends and I had just got done at a New Year's party and were being driven home by the designated driver. We're all having fun jamming to music like normal people, and we didn't notice a blue Ford Escape that had just slid in behind us and started to follow us until we were already on my street. Not thinking anything of it, the designated driver pulled into my driveway, and the blue Ford had blocked the driveway entrance, preventing us from leaving. We proceeded to calmly all freak the hell out and wonder what this guy was doing. I caught a glimpse of him while the brake lights were still on, and he was a large, heavy-set, bald guy with a large beard. We all sat there wondering what the hell he was doing or what he wanted. He turned his car off, and my friend started to reach into the back seat looking for some kind of defense weapon to go and confront this guy and see what he wanted. I guess the guy didn't realize that there were more than one person in the car, because he started his car again and drove off rather quickly. I quickly said my goodbyes to my friends and told them to be safe and hurried into the house. I was on guard watching through the windows for an hour afterwards, watching, but he never came back. I don't know what his intentions were, but I hope we never meet again.